It's week 2 of our medieval series, right? It's 116 of our Millennia Microcosm series, but we only started chapter 5 last week. So chapter 5 starts us in the section, a series of chapters in this book by philosopher Kenneth Smith. The book's called Millennia Microcosm. We spent most of the 114 weeks on chapter 4, which in one chapter tries to summarize the ancient worldview. How did the ancients see the world radically different from the way we see the world? And why? Why would they see it that way? And how does it hold together? Sort of learning how to put on those lenses and look at the world through alien eyes. So now we're beginning the second of the 3 parts of this book. And this part is much longer. It takes more time to explain. And this is the medieval civilization, 1,000 years of European history. We're talking about how did they conceive of the world, not only radically different from how moderns do, but radically different from how the ancients did. So as we work our way through the medievals, we'll also be recapitulating the ancients every time we come to a point of difference. And that's going to start with this very first paragraph. Last week, we spent the whole time on the first quote from Luke 9:24. This week, I'm going to skim past the other 2 quotes and get us right into the meat of the paragraph, which one or more of the people on this call tried. I think Stephen and Sharon both tried to get us into the actual first paragraph, and bless you both for doing that. We're going to actually do that this week.
Well, 924 you said last week, which probably is a certain observation, is that says give up the worldly life.
Yes.
The real action is in the unworldly. Get away from those secular animals. Give that all up. It's a waste of time. And join the church. Give it all up, and you'll be rewarded with 72 virgins in heaven.
No, I think that's a different religion.
Oh, that's another lot, right? They're a bit similar, aren't they?
We're a little arm wavy about what exactly happens in heaven.
The idea of heaven is very different for Muslims and Christians.
Yes. But there's a certain amount of arm waviness about exactly what the qualities of heaven are, other than the fact that it's decisively not hell. There's a lot of specificity about hell, and nobody wants to go there, and so heaven starts to look pretty good as the absence of hell. But we're not going to get into that this week. What we talked about last week, for Luisa's benefit, welcome to the call, Luisa. We haven't. I don't know if you've been here before, and I think last week was Aaron's first week too, if I recall correctly. So welcome again. And so last week, what we mainly did with this quote is talk about the way that this statement from Luke is structured like a paradox. The Greeks loved paradox. The ancient world loved paradox. Heraclitus, for example, is just rife with paradoxes. You can't step in the same river twice. But we talked about the way that the difference is that in the form that these paradoxes come down to us today, after an enormous amount of editing in the 100s and 200s, Jesus's words have been modified. And so where Heraclitus's paradoxes always have a great big arrow pointing in the direction of some specific thing about the world, like, can't step in the same river twice, clearly talking about a universe in which everything flows, even yourself, even a rock. It's all changing just at different paces. It's very hard to read the paradox from Heraclitus any other way, although people have tried. When they're in the grip of an ideology, they can turn anything inside out. But that's not the case with this Luke statement. The Luke statement is a paradox that can be used in radically different ways. And so it can be used, like Stephen was saying, to say the value system of the current corrupt Roman world order is not worthy of a human being, and you shouldn't love the things that the society tells you to love. You should be willing to give those things up for something better and deeper than that. You can see how that's present. You can sort of hear the echoes of whatever the wording originally was in Luke 9:24 before the editors started into it in the 100s and 200s. But by the time they're done, it can also be read to say that literally this life sucks, heaven is great, and so the sooner you die and go to heaven, the better. That it can be read not as being about giving up a value system, but it can be read as a death cult. And that was intentional. That editing was intentional. There was a lot of struggle around issues having to do with what did Christianity stand for? Was it going to be about poverty and caring for each other, or was it going to be about wealth and power and empire? There's an enormous amount of change that happens in the 100s and 200s to all of these, everything in the Gospels, everything in the epistles. They're being tampered with. But what's fascinating about the book that comes down to us today is that you can see the fingerprints, not just of the editors, but you can see the fingerprints of, you can hear from time to time the voice of the original speakers coming through the tampering. It's, I think, what intrigues a lot of people about that stuff. So we talked about that, but we didn't go any deeper into it. And I'm not going to this week either. We'll come back to it later. The same things we said last week about Luke apply to John 12:24-25. It's a very similar, very analogous statement. And of course, then you've got Nietzsche. But this particular Nietzsche quote, Kenneth is just being puckish. This is just Nietzsche slapping the church in this particular line. There are more profound engagements that Nietzsche has with Christianity in other places in his writings. This one is just saying, so when was that second coming supposed to be, and how come we're still stuck? When you look at the pace of change of other religions, you see, this one is still engaged in a change, but sort of similar way. So this is why I kind of wanted to skim us past these quotes and get us into the first paragraph. But I see we have questions, comments, concerns already. So before we go to paragraph 1, why don't we go to Sharon? Come off mute, Sharon.
Well, I just have a quick comment before you get past the preamble.
Yes,
because
please.
I read this whole paragraph, and I think I'm a pretty good reader, and it's pretty dense. It's pretty hard to understand. So I went back to the very first sentence where he says, "New wine in old wineskins," and I actually looked up what that metaphor meant. And so what he was saying, it is the medieval time. While this is the way I interpret it, it's still fermenting, and when you put new wine in old skins, the old skins burst, right? So I wanted to know how we apply that metaphor to this entire passage, because the Bible verses that he picked out, I thought they were not very pointed. But new wine in old skins probably talks about the arrival of a new epoch and the difficulty that it faces.
Yes, that's a great line. Thank you, Sharon. You're right. The choice of the title of the chapter is the pithiest thing in the first 10 or so lines. It reinforces something that those who've been with us since the beginning have heard. Those who are new to this might not have heard before, which is this existentialist philosophical tradition in how you look at history says that epochs are like organisms. They have a staying power. They have and I'm going to go back to an old Stephen terminology. They have a centripetal force that pulls them together. They're not just a start and then a stop. They're not just a moment in time with some boundaries, the way that we typically think of them, at least not according to these existentialist philosophers. They are, instead, there is a zeitgeist to an epoch, a worldview that is very powerful and that sort of enforces a particular kind of interpretation upon the world. And when an epoch ends, like the end of the ancient epoch with the fall of Rome and the rise of the medieval epoch, it doesn't happen gently or gradually. It may detach different parts of itself in widely spaced different periods of time, so that there's no clean boundary line. But the detachment is not a gentle go with the flow detachment. It's a revolution in world. In fact, frequently it's a complete inversion of values, as we'll be talking about repeatedly. The way that the ancients decided what things meant was not just different from the way medievals did, but the medieval worldview was deliberately rejecting the core premises of the ancient value system. It was going right to the heart of it and stabbing a dagger into it and saying, we don't believe in this promise anymore. We don't believe in this way of looking at the world anymore. What you held most precious, we are going to hold not just less precious, we're going to hold it least precious. We're going to move it to the bottom of the totem pole of priorities. That's what happens across this boundary. And so, the new wine and old wineskins, I think you're right, Sharon. It evokes this rupture that happens with the excess ferment, and the rupture happens because, Hegel would say the epoch has exhausted its moral resources. Its ability to persuade people to believe in it is gone. And like Augustine writes in City of God, that Rome was so obviously rotten and corrupt that it had to go. And it couldn't go as a little detail. The whole kit and caboodle had to go. It shamed everything associated with it, including the original ancient ethos that it falsely claimed to represent. That too got thrown. Baby goes with the bathwater. I mean, everything has to go. It's the closing sale. We're eliminating everything. Get out, stay out. So you see that in the title, New Wine and Old Wineskins. You certainly see that in the quotes from Luke and John that follow, that sense of everything that the powers that be in the world hold precious, we hold contemptible. We have inverted the value system on purpose, because we think the only way, well, and Colleen, great question, right? Did Rome really go, or did it continue in another form? We're going to talk about that extensively today and in the weeks and months to follow. It's a fascinating thing. I'm going to allude here as well to Hegel's dialectic, right? Which people summarize as thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but which Hegel's on record as saying he detests that way of describing his dialectic. He says the actual way to think of it is the bud, the blossom, and the fruit, although there are alternatives. And the thing about the bud, the blossom, and the fruit is that, first of all, you can see it's not just a cage match between two ideas with the weird belief that somehow something good will come out of it. It is that the way embryogenesis or evolution or any other long-term incremental development of an organism happens is it works as far as it can within its current stage of development until the basic framing of that stage becomes the cage it can't get out of, right? The Achilles heel that's baked in from the beginning, that at first was a strength, by the end of that period of development becomes the weakness. Like the chick developing in the egg. And there comes a point where you can't grow anymore without bursting the shell. The shell has to go. You have to stop being an egg. It's your only way to grow further. And so he describes how what's beautiful about the bud, the blossom, and the fruit, and in understanding Rome as a metaphor, is the whole purpose of the bud is to be closed up and protected from the ice and snow and the bitter cold. Its purpose is to isolate itself, to be armored against the world. If it can't do that, then it fails as a bud. But when spring comes, if it continues to be a bud, then it fails in its purpose. What it needs to do now is open up and become the most open thing there is. It has to be tender and delicate and welcoming. In fact, it has to be giving. It has to waft out the aroma into the air to attract the pollinators. And it has to have nectar to give, to feed the pollinators. It in exactly the way that the bud did the opposite of giving. It was withholding and protecting. The blossom has to be welcoming. And in order to do that, it has to reject the value system of the bud. It's why Hegel goes on and on about negation. You have to completely invert your value system to break out of the shell of the egg that's limiting you and move into your new stage of life. But as Hegel then continues, it's not that the old way is bad and the new way is good, because there will come a point when the blossom's limitations become too much. And if the blossom remains a blossom and does nothing further than that, the tree will never reproduce. The blossom has to shed the value system of the blossom and emerge into the value system or the meaning or architecture of the fruit in order to create the necessary conditions of, now we've integrated the strengths of the bud and the strengths of the blossom into the new form of the fruit that's capable of reproducing a tree. Each of these things involves a kind of continuation, like the medieval Rome compared to the ancient Rome, but it also involves a kind of rejection in which the medieval religious empire of Rome is in many ways the antithesis of the earlier ancient secular Rome. And the differences are both good for the thing that follows and bad for the thing that follows. It throws out the bathwater, but it also throws out the baby. And new kinds of corruption emerge in the new epoch that wouldn't have happened that way under the old epoch, as we see by the time we get to the 1400s and 1500s and the Borgia Pope and all the other incredible corruption that's happening that leads to the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the revolution into modernity. So the answer to did it really go or did it continue is yes and yes. It really went by continuing, but in a new form that rejected everything the old one stood for, except for all the parts that it didn't reject, which it carried on with it. These paradoxes that something is and is not. We step and we do not step, says Heraclitus. Into the same rivers, into the same waters we step and do not step. We are and we are not. These kinds of paradoxes are the natural result when a finite being like a human being tries to understand something that's infinite and complex. You can't fit infinity in the 7 plus or minus 2 registers of the finite mind. And so we distort what we try to understand. And that distortion at first takes the form of a cartoon oversimplification. But when we start to question the cartoon oversimplification and look more deeply at what are we missing, we discover that we're in the realm of paradoxes. That's why Jesus spoke in paradoxes. It's why Heraclitus writes in paradoxes. We'll find a lot of the people who try to get down to the deepest parts of life, what they're going to find is that you can only explain these things through paradox. So we'll talk about it. We'll get into the details. This is just sort of a I'm recapitulating 114 sessions of this philosophy seminar in about 5 minutes to try to to sketch in a little bit of an answer. It's a great question. That's why I sort of interrupted. And Sharon, thanks for pointing us at the title. You're right. The title's got a lot of meat and juice in it. So we'll come back to that repeatedly. Donald, you have something to add. You put your hand up when I was shooting my mouth off about Nietzsche. Something good's about to happen here.
No, well, it was the Nietzsche quote. I'm not sure about the context for this, if Nietzsche was aiming at the church or at modernity, but because I have heard Kenneth use this quote and riff on modernity, not medieval stuff, because like the Egyptians had their gods, and Phil knows all their names and I don't, but the Persians had Zoroastrianism, and the Greek and Latin polytheism, and then Jewish and Christian monotheism and whatever. And the point of this thing is that theologically, modernity is produced diddly. That a great civilization sort of needs the complete meal to present itself. And modernity, look, no new God. Maybe not 2,000 years, but since whatever that date is in the late medieval, early Renaissance period, nothing. Modernity been, I would say, philosophically barren also, but theologically barren. To be a new civilization, you should look back and maybe get a grasp that you should be offering a more complete vision in a civilization, not just a sort of, I don't know, throwing out stuff. And that's what I don't know who Nietzsche's target was here, but I know this quote gets used against modernity more than it gets used against, I think, the medieval. I mean, well, that's enough of that.
No, that's good. You're right. And this is coming out of the Antichrist, his book, The Antichrist. And I'll put the full quote here. A translation of the quote. Of course, as we talk about frequently here, translations are a risky business. So we're not reading Nietzsche here. We're reading a translator's interpretation of Nietzsche. But it's clear from this that from the larger context that Nietzsche is talking about what you say he's talking about. He's saying, how can we be so far into the modern epoch and modernity hasn't produced its own religion? Are we so empty and barren spiritually that we've got nothing to add. We'll just carry on the momentum of previous religions because we have nothing to add ourselves. And this goes to the critique of modernity, that like the Romans, we're anti-philosophical and really anti-religious. We're so deeply into pragmatism and utilitarianism that we don't care why we're doing anything or whether we should do anything. We only care about what's the most efficient way to get what we want, which of course is the deepest anti-philosophical posture one can take. It says, don't ask. I just started rewatching HBO's series Rome, and it has, because I'm taking a Latin class. Well, I'm studying Latin as an autodidact with a couple of friends, and I want to include a little bit of culture each week. You know, learning more about Roman culture and history. And the thing I remember so poignantly from the first time I watched HBO's Rome is that it's got the sequence in which Seneca gets murdered for being a philosopher, basically, for, you know, asking questions, for doing the things a philosopher is supposed to do. And that fate, you know, really sums up the Roman opinion about philosophy, which is it's for losers. Winners have swords and they kill people, and losers sit around thinking and talking and they deserve to die because they're getting in the way of what it is we want to do. You know, the comparison that Kenneth Smith always makes between Rome as a corrupt form of the ancient worldview. He compares to, he calls them the mafiosi of the ancient world, that their whole focus is power and, you know, how to get what we want. And, you know, you see that in Tacitus. I quote this every week, don't I? Tacitus, what does Tacitus say about the Pax Romana? They make a desolation and call it peace. It's like, that's not peace. And this is what Martin Luther King Jr. is echoing when he talks about the frustration with people who think that if it's quiet, then you have a real peace. He says you can't have peace without justice. To be peace, it has to be healthy and vibrant and just. If it's just the quiet of oppression because people are afraid to talk, that's not peace. And when he says that, he's echoing Tacitus, who's a Roman and would know. You know, he's right in there talking to the people in the nobility of Rome. And he knows their private conversations, and his assessment is these people are morally bankrupt. You can't believe anything they say. They're not like the Athenians where they just come out and say, this is who we are and this is what we stand for. They're a corrupt form of life, which is something Augustine is going to come back to over and over and over. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind. Oh, by the way, thank you, Donald. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, I have looked at the fall of the Western Empire in some depth, and I think something that's underrated, that there was an economic decline which was inevitable. And where this Western Europe first appeared in the whole historical era, you know, going back to the beginning of the Axial Age, where we get most of our religions, actually. I mean, even Jesus was, you know, it was another chapter in the Babylonian captivity. We've got Buddha, we've got the thinkers in China, you know, famously they point out these people sort of show up in the same era, and we're still in their boat. But a thing that happened to the Western Empire is it had made wealth from mining. It mined silver. This was exported to the East. And eventually, of course, they hit the water table. And they couldn't go any deeper. And that seems to have been an element in economic decline. Even iron for the common man, probably from early classical times when suddenly everything had blossomed, probably the cost probably increased 15 times. If you wanted a lump of iron, if you got a lump of iron as wages in the Spartan era, you're going to get a lump of iron that was 15 times larger than what a guy got in the Dark Ages. This lack of iron for tools, especially for Europe, is significant. Because Europe's not that blessed. It's not a China. It's not an India. It's not even the river systems of the Middle East. It's a place which is a bit of an oddity. Normally, you know, that latitude, you got Siberia and Canada. And my impression is having a lot of iron tools is what you need to make European farmland work. And if iron gets very expensive, you're going downhill. But another thing about the late Roman Empire, I would say that they were top heavy. There was a lot of the idle rich, and they were expropriating wealth for their own good. For example, iron, which was becoming more scarce, which should have gone to the military. Hey, I could use that for tools on my farm and make myself rich. Another bizarre element, of course, there is a claim that Christianity was the cause of the decline of the empire. I say the opposite. I actually think Christianity kept it going a bit longer than it would have done otherwise. This'll damn me with a lot of people. But Christians brought in a new system. I mean, you're an invading barbarian and you run up against a bishop who talks. You can listen to him. The smart move would be to chop his head off. But if you start listening to him, it's like a used car salesman. You might get stung. I mean, who did Attila the Hun meet when he invaded Italy? He must have been bamboozled. Give me somebody straight. Give me somebody who talks about violence. Don't give me one of these guys. I'm getting out of here. I can't stand these crazies. But the Western Empire, the Eastern Empire, were using these bishops, this church organisation to back up the empire. And I think it was actually rather effective. But, you know, I'd say there was an economic decline there. Now, something I do want to go back to is that little line there. But spirit is the idea of absolute or unencumbered power, unconditioned and by and abstracted from the web of natural transactions. I will mention something else. I might have mentioned it before, and this is the famous line of Sartre, where he says, you know, existence precedes essence. And by looking at Schelling, what Schelling had to say, I realised at the very simple level, all this is saying is reality precedes ideas. Now, we as, well, animals do it as well. We form a model of reality. We call it the mind, we call it ideas. Now, we can abstract those ideas and take a description of the world and turn it into a prescription. We're operating through prescriptions all the time. We've gotten to the point where certain academics have decided that their view of the world is more important than reality itself. And that's a danger point. And Schelling seemed to be accusing Hegel of the absolute prescription. So Hegel's in jail now. You're going to have to get him out, Rick. But that line there, but spirit is the idea of absolute or unencumbered power. You're just going to have to explain that one to me.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sharon that this is with this opening paragraph, you know, Kenneth has worked it and worked it and worked it over and over, and he's making it dense. So it's covering an enormous amount of ground very rapidly. And I will, over the course of today, I think we'll get through paragraph 1 today. Over the course of today, I'll deconstruct it so we can see what he's talking about. But of course, his main concern in the opening paragraph is the slap in the face. So at this point, you know, where we have spent so long getting to know the ancient worldview, what he wants us to understand is the way in which the medieval worldview created itself in direct opposition to the ancient worldview. And it is we read the Bible as though it's talking to us, but it was never meant for us. It was talking to the ancients. They were having an argument with the people of their time who had a different value system than our value system. And so for, less for Louisa and Aaron and Colleen, since you guys are just joining us, last week and this week, but for the rest of us who've been here on this ride for 114 sessions, this opening paragraph is he's trying to capture in a number of kind of painful nuggets in quick succession in which we see the medievals throwing down ancient values in quick succession. We just fought hard to get to where we could understand this value system, and right off the bat, he's knocking it. So as we walk through it today, I'm going to show how each of these sentences is pointing directly at one of the core principles of those lettered sections in chapter 4, and saying the medievals believe that's wrong, and the medievals believe that's wrong, and the medievals believe that's wrong. It's like Hegel says, it's a negation. It's a complete takedown of all of the core ideas. And the reason for the takedown is much like when Hitler said, I want to go east and I want to clear out the Slavs because then I'll have all this great land in which I can build my mighty new Reich. The idea is to clear room to develop your ideas, to develop your new civilization. And the medievals want to do that. They want to clear out the ground. But the way that they clear it out is using the rhetoric of their target audience. They're speaking to the ancients. They're trying to defeat the ancients rhetorically, and then use that as the basis to set up a new value system. So we'll go through all of this. And the thing that you talk about here in particular, I'll just give a foretaste of. The idea of spirit as absolute or unencumbered power, unconditioned by and abstracted from the web of natural transactions. This is the statement about how in the ancient world, nature is the top of the totem pole, not the gods. The gods come second. In the ancient world, gods aren't like the Christian God or the Muslim God or the Jewish God. They're not like any of these gods. They are expressions of aspects of nature. They're attempts to anthropomorphize parts of nature that if we don't pay attention to them, we're going to wreck our lives. You have to know, if you live the life of a fisherman or a seaborne trader, you have to respect the ocean. And if you don't respect the ocean, you're going to drown. That's what's going to happen to you. So they have a god, Poseidon, and Poseidon's there to remind all these ocean-going Greeks, don't forget to pay attention. Pay attention to the weather, pay attention to the waves, pay attention to all the things about the ocean, or your life is forfeit. And it's the same with all the others. Aphrodite, how does even a man who thinks of himself as the manliest of men, and he's totally in charge, and he's sober and he's pragmatic, but he could fall head over heels in love the next day, and there goes all of his sense. I mean, attraction is this incredible power over human beings that seduces us, that possesses us. And the Greeks are warning us, Aphrodite isn't the good goddess, she's the dangerous goddess. I mean, look at Helen of Troy, right? I mean, there goes all of Bronze Age civilization because, Menelaus and Agamemnon and all the rest of them can't stop thinking about Helen. The Greek gods are therefore encumbered power, relative power, conditioned by and enmeshed in the web of natural transactions. Not one of them is supernatural. Not one of them. And that's hard for us. Nobody writes Greek mythology books from this perspective. We are the heirs to medievalism. So when we translate Greek myths, we project little versions of Jehovah or Muhammad or Yahweh onto the Greek gods. We want them to be inferior to those, great monotheistic gods who might be the same God. But we also want them to look like it because that's our idea of a God. Even an atheist is the atheist against a specific religion and its formulation of what is a God, what is the soul, what is an afterlife. So it's very hard for us to understand the idea that to the ancients, Poseidon was not above the ocean. He wasn't greater than the ocean. He didn't create the ocean. He was the ocean. He was the embodiment of it as an authority in our lives. Just like Ares was the embodiment of the authority that conflict has over us in our lives. He wasn't like somebody sitting around saying, hey, I need you to make sacrifices and obey my rules. That's the Judeo-Christian Muslim God. The Greek gods, Nietzsche says, no Greek god ever told a Greek, thou shalt. They didn't give commandments. That wasn't their thing. Their thing was, I'm here to tell you a tale about what happened when Oedipus didn't pay attention. I'm here to tell you a tale about what happened when so-and-so didn't pay attention. Pay attention. Nature's dangerous. You have to respect it. It's like being around a bear. You know, don't get trampled by the elephants fighting in the grass. This is what Greek religion was. And so the value system of the ancients was first nature. Nature's authoritative, which is why Aristotle relentlessly says, kata phusin, man by nature, according to nature, desires to know. Because to Aristotle, by nature that's the end of the argument. Rhetoric doesn't matter, persuasion doesn't matter, logic doesn't matter. All of the tools of argument don't matter.
I will bring in Goethe's accusation of Hegel. Hegel's still in jail. And that
We're getting
is,
there.
well, more or less Goethe was saying that Hegel was a man of ideas, and he was
Yes.
very good at it too.
Yes.
Only problem is he didn't get the message.
Yes. Well, yes, and we'll come back to that for sure.
Okay.
But I'm trying to give some background for Kaleem and Louisa and for Aaron. And for Natasha. Welcome, Natasha, to our call. It's like this is some of what what we're talking about here is that this sentence, but spirit is the idea of absolute or unencumbered power, unconditioned by and abstracted from the web of natural transactions. He's not just saying something. He's all that list of attributes of spirit are the exact opposites of the attributes that the ancients attributed to spirit, because they saw their gods as relative powers, encumbered powers, conditioned by and enmeshed in the web of natural transactions. Poseidon is the ocean, Ares is war, and he's not above war, and they didn't believe that the gods made the universe.
Well, okay, if you had
Gods,
said, but the medieval spirit is the idea of absolute power, that
right,
would make more sense.
exactly, exactly. And in this, we see how the medieval conception of God is a complete rejection of the ancient value system that said that gods are subordinate to nature. It said, not our God. That's why you should convert. Our God's bigger than your gods because our God is bigger than nature. You
And of
worship
course,
nature.
we've inherited the idealism that
Yes.
what's up here is God-given.
Yes.
You can't have any problems with it. It's only if I'm a bit immoral that I'm going to be misled. There's no
Well,
lacunae
yes.
here. There's no holes I'm going to fall down because God created it. He's the ultimate warranty, the ultimate guarantee that if I'm a good
Yeah.
boy, my mind works.
Yeah, but in this sentence, he's not talking about man, right? He doesn't mean the spirit of man here. He's talking about absolute spirit, and the only absolute spirit under the medieval worldview is God himself. And this is a massive transformation in the way we look at the world, because not only is nature dethroned and stuck to the bottom of the totem pole underneath God and man now in the medieval epoch, not only that, but to the ancients, nature is full of contradictions and paradoxes and competing sources of order. That's why they're polytheistic, because there are different parts of nature that have authority under different times and different places. But the medieval conception is there's only one source of order. Nature is not any source of meaning at all in any way, shape whatsoever. It is merely a creation. It's merely the signature of God. God is the source of all good things, all wisdom, all authority. It all comes from one place. And so it's a massive reorientation of how you look at the world. It's just, it couldn't be, there's no change you could make that would be more devastating to the ancient worldview than the change that's in this sentence that you've called out. And
Well,
this is what I'm saying he's doing in this paragraph.
This is
Say
the
that again?
imperial God.
It's the imperial
Before,
God,
we had lots of kings.
but
Now
only
we've
one
got
emperor.
one big emperor of the
That's
God.
right. That's right on the money, Stephen. And that goes to Kaleem's question earlier about did Rome end or did Rome continue? And it's like, well, you know, the concept of emperor has been now relocated out of the person of the emperor and placed into the person of God. There's one source of authority, but not just among men, but at a sacred level, at a meaning and power and creativity level. And this is the concept of spirit. And this is why he calls the medieval epoch the era of the reign of spirit.
Well,
Like,
okay,
going to
that
be,
winds it up for the heretics then.
Well, yes, and we'll be talking about that for the next year, won't we? Because it's like the medieval epoch, the medievals wanted it, but that imperial religion wanted above all things to be the one unitary source of authority that would unite us all with a single coherent, correct dogma to represent God's one true plan. But instead, it comes right in from the ashes. You know, in Hollywood movies, the cool scene where the guy walks away and the building behind him blows up in flames as he walks in slow motion. This is the medievals walking from the wreckage of Rome, right? Saying, you know, that era is over. We're the cool kids now. Get us, right? That's like, you know, Quentin Tarantino in a nutshell. Is what the medievals thought of themselves. We're going to bring peace. We've overthrown all your false icons. We're going to bring order to the world. And yet, that wasn't what happened. They came riding out of the gate, not as one guy on a horse,
left
but as one guy on a horse, with 15 heresies side by side with him, all riding their own horses. They couldn't get these guys to unite
Rome
over the
was
course
nothing
of
but
1,000
Sodom
years.
and Gomorrah, and we're going to the brave new world.
Yes. So, you know, this is setting all of that up. That there's a contradiction between the way they conceive of the flow of authority from the one God, but then the reality of their own religion is they don't agree. There's a dozen different interpretations of this stuff, and they're all competing with each other from day one, from before day one, even before the medieval epoch starts. They weren't unified, and they weren't at the end either. It's one way to read the medieval epoch is the desperate attempt to unite a fractious group, but it was like herding cats, and in the end, it failed. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on. Oh, you're off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Am I off?
Thanks, Steve.
Okay. It seems to me if you're going to adapt the organic model, which is doing, it seems like organisms, living things, unfold in time. And it unfolds depending on what species or what situation is. It unfolds at different times. And my thought is that it seems to me that Christians, this new order of God, supreme God, unfolded very slowly because it was in the egg for a long time. I mean, because it has to deal with the power that be. You know, Rome itself was a very powerful civilization. A lot of stuff, a lot of armies, a lot of physical power, and so you know, so in some sense, the metaphor seems very interesting that the early Christians were being killed, and they had to live underground in the catacombs. It seems like the catacombs provided kind of a shell to protect them from hatching too soon, you know? But it was really, in some sense, a very interesting thing that happened is this relationship between the egg bursting, you know, how does it burst? Is it burst slowly? You know, to me, it seems to me it started with St. Paul in a way, because the early Christians were really trying to reform the Jewish religion. I mean, they were satisfied with that. But St. Paul says, no, we have a greater situation to do, which is to integrate, in some sense, the Gentiles, you know, the people who are in the past, but, you know, but they were left behind. And so there's plenty of them. We could integrate them into it. We could create a movement that's much bigger than just a few dissonant Jews fighting for whatever it is. And I think St. Paul, in some sense, was beginning to wrap, in some sense, a kind of synthesis between the old religion, the old spirit, or the poor people, and attracted them to the church because they provided this new possibility, because they certainly were not doing well under the old tradition. But, you know, but also it seems to me the fall of Rome wasn't merely a kind of a spiritual push. It was really a funny thing that got help from the barbarians, because it was the barbarians repeated, you know, beating on Rome that in a sense it slowly kind of broke the outer crust, you could say, the shell of the civilization itself. And that I think it might have been as late as 400 AD or something like that. that in a sense Rome finally sort of fell in a big way. And I think there was at that time the church had already grown. I mean, it's already sort of emerged from the shell, and it's really become sort of partially integrated with Constantine and so forth. And it seems to me like what happened was at the end, when before the physical falling of Rome, essentially, there was a, I wouldn't say a synthesis, but there was an alliance between the upper crust of society, the power that be, uh, and the church, to in a sense to create this sort of duality in some sense, because the church has been established through the Roman Empire, because they had, little outposts that preached these, the Christian teachings, but they needed, in some sense, to expand that in terms of the bureaucracy and defend it. So there was still a lot of brutality left, because there was a lot of pagans that wasn't buying what the Christians had to say, right? And those, well, you still need the power on earth to beat them down. So that was not a peaceful period, you know? And so in some sense, and I think finally what happened, it seems to me Charlemagne has something to do with that. Charlemagne was a very, very powerful person, but he was interested in, I guess, learning. He established, the screw scribe. As a matter of fact, I taught typography. He was very instrumental in some, in terms of the writing was, falling into kind of chaos. And he sent some people down to Rome to study the Roman alphabet and make it correct. And so, in some sense, there was a synthesis between the writers, which he believed in the learning, and this sort of, in a sense, going back to Rome. So there still remained a synthesis, in some sense, of at least the physical structure of learning, which is the alphabet. And so, and of course, they also created the lowercase, which was the Romans didn't have. They had some other kind of writing, but they didn't have the lowercase. And it was really that invention of the lowercase that allowed for the expression of the Romantic languages in a true form between the capitals, the imperial letters, and the lowercase letters, which has much more flow. So in some sense, that relationship, as a matter of fact, he was supposedly crowned as the Holy Roman Emperor, which a scholar described. It was neither holy or Roman or an empire. None of that was true. And it's true that, when he died, his sons, I think, did not go along with this sort of learning. They were not interested. So it sort of kind of fell apart. So he could have been established in a new way, because when he was crowned, he was crowned, I guess, in one sense, as Caesar, but he was crowned by, the bishop, the Pope. And so therefore he had the unity of the physical manifestation on earth and the spiritual manifestation. So, but
Bring it
when
home,
that
Phil,
fell
bring it
apart,
home.
when that fell apart, what happened was that the physical structure and the spiritual structure remained, and it really began to be the how should I say, the knights, the whole bit. So a fracture into these little kingdoms. So in some sense, it survived into these little, and that's why when you look at Europe, it's so divided, because there's so many little, kingdoms in a way. And Europe trying to create the European Union finds it kind of hard, because it's hard to make the synthesis between the economy and the military and the political structure. So that remains in some sense,
Yes.
whereas the United States,
Yes.
the synthesis was really much more unified, even though we had states. But because they had such a long tradition of these kingdoms and territories and principalities, that it really remained sort of somewhat divided because they were separate little cultures.
You've
So
covered
in
an
a sense, you
enormous
could
amount of
say,
ground.
so in some sense, you could say that the Roman Empire sort of wither away, but it remained in the political structure and the economic structure, and of course it remained the church and the spiritual structure. So in
Yes.
some sense, you could say it transformed. And my thought is in a funny way, because the barbarians actually kind of took down Rome, actually made that I guess blossoming much more pronounced, because the Eastern Empire, because they had such great walls, the shell just remained hard to break.
I'm gonna cut you off there, Phil. You're covering like the entire period of the medieval epoch in one comment. We've got a year to get through this material. We don't have to do it all today. We're just doing the introduction today.
Well, what I'm just saying is that, yeah, it didn't really fall. It just sort of like transformed, and that's important. So so there'll remain a synthesis between the earthbound situation and the heavenly situation. So
yeah,
leave
and
it
that's
there.
right on. That's right on. Yeah, it's the the simple questions, the sort of the initial question of like, when did Rome fall, becomes a whole lot more complicated. It's like Colleen was alluding to in his earlier comment in the thread. It's like, did it fall or did it continue? And it's like, yeah, it's complicated. The answer isn't as simple as one or the other. It did both, sort of, in a way. But we'll be able to, we'll all see this in great detail together in the weeks and months ahead as we get into this. Right now, we're just trying to establish the initial premise of the medieval epoch and what it was up to. So I think with that, I'm going to call on Colleen. Welcome, Colleen. It's good to see you. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hi everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Nice to meet you all. Fascinating conversation. I feel like I've already learned a ton just from this last 30 minutes or hour. So thank you so much for explaining how all of your different points of view and offering this space as well. I mean, I think I just have a lot of questions. But things that you prompted. I mean, I don't buy this whole end of civilization. I think, this is something that's an invented term, the same way that the Renaissance and the Dark Ages or whatever is a term that's invented in retrospect. The golden age of Islam, whatever it is. So it just made me think. I went to the Vatican a few years ago, just visiting Italy, and having studied classical art and so on, I looked and I just saw these monumental statues of the saints, and they were exactly the same as the monumental statues of the Olympian gods. And so when we say it transformed, I don't even know if it transformed. It seems like it's more of a reskinning, and by that I mean, if the premise of Christianity, and I'm not saying the spirit of Christianity, I'm saying as it appeared by the 5th and 6th centuries, if we look at the behavior of the papacy, especially when it comes into power, do we see self-abnegation? Do we see emphasis of spirit? We see an accumulation of wealth. We do not see that war ends. We see that popes are in fact warmongers. So the enrichment of the church, okay, I think that's an interesting thing to see, is that you have all these monastic orders, and at the same time they're incredibly rich and self-denying. It's weird. I think seems to be a unique thing. But at the same time, I remember stories of the early kind of clash with Roman culture and Christianity, and I made a point about many early Roman critics of Christianity talking about it as a slave's religion. And yet when they talk about their own practices in devoting themselves to, for example, Mithras, they have to go through the same torture that we see a Jesuit priest going through when he's torturing himself to pay penance for his sins. So I think that the behaviors, and I see this in the Islamic world as well, by the way. So I see a lot of parallels here. We see again, the oppression of pagans. Theodosius, Charlemagne killed a lot of pagans, and these aren't isolated incidents, are they? They're kind of a continual thing that happens when you need it to happen. Building on the literacy and the achievements of empire. Empire doesn't end. Yes, we see a fragmentation of the original Roman Empire into kingdoms, but do we see, with Christianity or any other religion, do we see an end to a war or even a slowing down? Do we see any of these behavioral changes? Again, I know that there are times in medieval Europe that we see kind of an end of the world cults and all this kind of stuff. But really, was that something new? I mean, I think we saw that in the Judaic history as well at the time of Christ. These kind of end of the world type of cults. So I think I just have a lot of questions around imposing a pattern which I'm not sure actually ever really changed, right? So that's more of what I'm questioning, and also even the idea that I think Cicero said, power creates its own rules. Did that ever change? Right? Did that really ever change? I mean, when a pope came in and wanted to, stop something happening, he'd incur the divine whatever, in the same way that people before that. Corruption, if we talk about corruption, I mean, Athenian culture was corrupt in the way that Socrates viewed it, right? And conversely, they saw him as corrupt, right? Corrupting the youth. So, I do think that a lot of the things that we talk about when we identify things are symptoms of change, but I don't necessarily think that at the ground level, there was that much. I'm struggling to see how, someone
Yes.
who went from belief in whatever several gods, which seemed to be fairly pragmatic, to adding in Christ as the Son of God initially, and as you said, the church itself was split into dozens of divisions already, right, by that stage. So I'm just wary of some of these things. But again, just brilliant points from everyone, and thank you very much for sharing it.
Thanks for sharing your questions, Colleen. Yeah, there's a certain trickiness to trying to, and I don't know quite what to do about this other than to take seriously when people bring up questions like the one you just brought up. There's a trickiness to coming in at session 116 out of a sequence. So on the one hand, we absolutely want to structure this in such a way that people can do that, so that they can come in and they can engage in the discussion and on the one hand bring their new perspectives, and on the other hand somehow catch up with kind of what we've talked about before. On the other hand, we also want to keep advancing the discussion to the next topic. And when I say this, I'm not saying that, I've chosen one and I want to trample the other. That's absolutely not the case. I actually want to I want to thread the needle and reconcile both competing sets of needs, because we've got different kinds of people here. So one of the ways I want to do this is to say, I'll give these little capsule summaries from time to time of kind of things that we've talked about in the last 114 that I think might be useful. And in this particular place, what I didn't talk about when we first started today is, why did Kenneth write this book? What's his goal? And that's kind of where we should start. What is the point of this book? The point of this book is that moderns, as part of our ideology, of our worldview, we believe we see the world the way it really is, and that we're the first people to do that. We think our ancestors were primitive, backward savages, and the farther back you go, the more primitive and backward and savage they were, and that we're virtually Captain Picard on the deck of the Enterprise. We're that good. We're just that good. In fact, you can see it in the name, moderns. We're so good. We're so modern. And as you know, things that aren't modern are obsolete and therefore bad. And, so there's all this self-flattery built into the very structure of modernity, where even the critics of modernity, and this is part of the Hegelian / Aristotelian take on history, even the critics of an epoch, when they make a revolution, the revolution brings them back into the core value system of the epoch. They question the things that are not core and think that they're doing something revolutionary, when in fact what they're doing is reinforcing the core. So Lenin sets out to destroy capitalism in Russia and make the new society that will be as far from capitalism as you can get. And look at Russia today. Lenin set that in motion. Lenin set in motion the sequence of events that would bring Russia to capitalism. Now you know that guy's spinning in his grave at this point. You could power a city if you hooked up a dynamo to the man. So, but this is Hegel's point about epochs, is that they have this power over us, where when we try to critique them, we don't actually know where the Achilles heel of modernity is. And so we end up tackling something that isn't the Achilles heel. It ends up being just some sacrificable detail. And so you end up with the Soviet system going on for decades in Russia, where people, just like in the United States, are treated like a number. How much money do you have? How many votes do you have? You know, these are some of the US concerns, but then the Soviet concerns are, did you meet your production quotas on the current stage of the 5-year plan? Again, it comes down to numbers, reducing people to quanta, and then treating the quanta as though that's a satisfactory replacement for dealing with the person as an actual living human being. And so in this sense, while believing that they had completely rebelled against capitalism, they were in fact staying true to modernity, which is obsessed with quanta and abstraction, and not treating things the way they are, but according to some systematic theory. So the reason I bring this up is that some of the core ideologies of modernity include the following. This is the best we have ever been. Nobody's ever been better than we are. We're moderns. That's what it means to be modern. We're the best. But if we're not that great, we have a counter argument. This is also core to modernity. If there are problems, then people have always been that way. Even if it sucks, no matter how hellish it gets, it still can't be better than this. We're still the best. Even if this is hell, then it's always been hell. There are no alternatives. Nothing can be better. This is the only way people can be organized. Human nature has always been the same as it is now. People were always as violent. They were always as ruthless. They were always as cynical. And, deal with it. Don't be a snowflake. This is part of modernity's core argument. If you push past the pretty part, then it brings out the mean part. And the mean part is, don't hope for anything more than this. In the United States, for example, you see it expressed in the following way. All those other countries may give out healthcare to their citizens, but it's a sham. Don't believe it. Robbing you blind and saying your money or your life and bankrupting you when you get sick is as good as it could possibly be. And if those other countries seem to be doing something different, well, then either they're giving up all their freedom or all their money, or they're teetering into collapse, and tomorrow they'll collapse. And you'll see that it can't be any better than I rob you blind every time you go to the doctor. This core kind of gaslighting, bullying idea that you shouldn't hope for anything more, and if you do, then you're a crazy utopian. What the hell is wrong with you? You could be saying something like, well, I don't go bankrupt if I get sick in Britain. Why can't we do things as well as Britain? They don't say, well, let's talk about that rationally. They say, you're a crazy utopian. How dare you want anything to be the slightest bit better than they are? It's impossible. Nothing can be better. So this is the modernist critique of history. The past has nothing to offer. Everybody was always as venal. They were always as cynical. They're always as corrupt. Don't look to the past for any answers at all. The past is worse by definition because we're modern. Modern means better. So Kenneth Smith is saying that's not true. That's an ideology. And we're trapped in that ideology. And even when we try to rebel against modernity, our acts of rebellion carry this ideology with us. And we continue to impose it on our understanding of history and the possibilities for human life and so forth. And so the book he's writing is as an alternative to that. He's saying, what if instead of buying the ideology of modernity, what if we learn to treat modernity as one among many epochs, each of which has its own things that it sees more clearly than other epochs, and its own things that it sees less clearly than other epochs? How would we find out where the blind spots of moderns are so that we can free ourselves from that trap, so that we can learn to see more broadly than modernity wants to allow us to do? He says one of the ways to do that is we immerse ourselves in two alien worldviews, the ancient worldview and the medieval worldview. We don't look at them in a polemic. We don't look at them to try to say, well, who's right? Because we're mortals. We don't get anything right. We get partial truths. Instead of looking at the Greeks as our precursors that lead to the glorious march of history that culminates in moderns, if instead we look at them as an alternative set of choices, then we can critique them in terms of what do they see less clearly than us, which moderns would be willing to do, but also what do they see more clearly than we see, which moderns don't want to do, because we don't want to admit anybody sees anything better than we do. We're the best. We're number one. USA, USA, USA. So with that in mind, part of the critique is the idea that there might have been wars in the past, but maybe there weren't always wars, right? It's natural to assume that the bad things we do now, as moderns, it's natural to assume the bad things we do now, everybody always did them. But what if that's not true? What if not everybody always did those things? Or what if they did them differently than we do them? And if they did them differently than we do them, then it had a different architecture to it, a different construction. It's like the way you look at disease. And on the one hand, you can say a fatal disease is a fatal disease. Who cares? You're going to die either way. There's nothing to see here. And then a doctor says, no, because the progression of cancer is very different from the progression of heart disease. And the treatment of cancer is very different from the treatment of heart disease. And if we go beyond the surface similarities to look at the architectural differences within them, then we can actually meaningfully engage with these things and start to make a difference in the world. So we can ask ourselves questions. What is the nature of the corruption in Roman to ancient world, say around 400, 450, current era? And then, yeah, we can compare it to the corruption in the papacy in 1450, but we can also contrast it and say, well, what's different about the form of corruption? Why are they corrupt? How are they corrupt? What's the structural nature of the corruption? And especially, what did they think that they were doing when they engaged in this corruption? And when we dig at that level, what we discover is that the ancients had an alien worldview compared to the medievals. And the medievals had an alien worldview compared to us. The whole way that they evaluated things. How could Torquemada torture people to death during the Inquisition and do it out of love? Out of love. And our answer is, well, of course, he must not have done it out of love. It can't be, because we wouldn't have done, if we were torturing people, we'd do it out of pragmatism. So he must have done it out of pragmatism. But the medievals weren't like us. He really could be doing it out of love. And if he's doing it out of love, a different argument would work on him than if you try to talk to him about pragmatism. You can explain things like, yeah, Guantanamo. What we do at Guantanamo and what Torquemada did with the victims of the Inquisition, on the surface, they're similar. But under the surface, they're very different. And one of the ways that you see this most clearly is, and I'll give two examples of kind of the indication that Kenneth Smith might be onto something here. The first example is, we're used to the idea of genocide being the norm, where people say, my language is the best, my country is the best, my religion is the best, my economy is the best, I'm going to exterminate all other religions, languages, countries, and economies and replace them with my own. We're used to that because that's what's happening now. The world economy is one specific form of economy. And the whole everybody should speak English for my convenience, and the USA is the best country, and everybody should be part of the US. All of this stuff is a natural outflow of this idea of genocide as being normal, which makes it astonishing when you look back at the ancient Greeks and realize they never fought a war over religion. Ever. Not once. When they encountered other religions, they didn't try to exterminate them. They didn't try to convert them. They didn't do either one of those things. They engaged them in conversation because as polytheists, they started from the proposition that they did not understand the divine. The divine is infinite, but mortals are finite. And so our understanding of God is always imperfect. And because it's imperfect, that means we're missing important things. And since we're missing important things, we're in danger. This is what the Greeks believed. The reason for religion is to reduce the amount of danger we have in the world by paying attention to the things that matter. If I'm a Greek and I'm in Alexander the Great's army and I come to the borders of India and I find out they have an entirely different religion, if I were a medieval, I'd want to exterminate that religion and convert them all to Christianity. And a modern might do the same thing or imagine that that would be natural. But a Greek says, oh my God, they have different gods than we do. How could we have missed all these gods? I mean, what's going to go wrong for us? Are we going to collapse because of our failure to notice these gods and honor them correctly? So what they did, and you see this in the Roman Empire too, is they would build temples to other people's gods. In Rome, you can find temples that the Romans built in Gaul to Gaulish gods. In Britain, there's a famous temple to Sulis, the goddess of a spring, and the Romans built it. They weren't trying to stamp out the native religion. They were actually investing in it. And they did that because they didn't have this idea of religious genocide. They had this idea of, we must always be learning about the other gods that we're missing and expanding on it. This is an alien worldview. Their behavior can't be explained in medieval or modern terms. It just doesn't make sense in our terms. The other counterexample that I think is really interesting is from the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. In the modern era, when we want to slaughter people, we put out a big PR campaign. And our PR campaign says, look how noble we are. We are here for, we're not here to steal your petroleum. We're here to bring you freedom. We think that the previous election, it was corrupt, but now we're going to fix things and you'll be free. And it's just a coincidence that all our oil companies are going to move in and take all your oil. Just pay no attention to that. Listen to our PR campaign about how much we love you and we're here for your freedom. That's how the US engages in nefarious foreign policy. But you know how the Athenians did it? Thucydides documents this. In the Malian dialogues, the Athenians say, we're bigger and stronger than you are, and we're really awful. And if we have to fight for your city, then when we win, and we will win because we're bigger than you are, we're going to murder all your men, we're going to rape all your women, and then we're going to sell your women and children into slavery. And that's what we're going to do. And that's horrible. And I hate that that's the way the world is, but that's how we are. So really, if you surrender now, it'll go better for you because then we won't, have to do all those things to you. But if you don't surrender, then we're going to be the most awful people you've ever seen. Now, can you imagine a US president giving that as a State of the Union address? I mean, really, would that ever happen in any modern country, anywhere in the world? Would they say, we are awful, horrible people, and you do not want to fight us?
Yes.
We never say that. We always lie. We always relentlessly lie. We're obsessed with our image, and we want to seem to be different than we are. We care deeply. And we care so deeply that if somebody reveals our secret wire cables where we tell the truth to each other, and the truth is nasty, then we pursue multi-year vendettas to get that guy arrested and throw him in jail. You look at what happens to the people involved in WikiLeaks. We are obsessed with covering up the truth. Orwell didn't get his ideas through speculation. He was looking around at the behavior of modern governments and saying, we're just a bunch of liars. And when you read the speeches in the Peloponnesian War, the shocking thing is how much they just tell you what's on their mind. They're so candid that the only possible explanation is that it's an alien worldview, just like the way that they relate to other religions. So where is this going? Is this saying we should all be Greeks? Well, of course not. Kenneth Smith doesn't want us to be Greeks. I don't want to be Greeks. The ancients did horrible things. There are plenty of things bad that they did. But the interesting thing is not just how much do we have in common, but how much do we differ? Why do we do the things we do? Which are the sorts of things we would do or won't do? Those things change from epoch to epoch. And what Kenneth Smith is saying is if we study those differences, not just the similarities, those are worth studying, but if we study the differences, then we'll discover the possibility that human beings can live differently than the way that we all lived for the last 500 years. It'll create an awareness of choices around us that we didn't know we had. As long as we imagine that people always thought and valued the way that we think and value, then we're trapped and there's no hope. We might as well just give up and go along with whatever the powers that be want, because people can't be better than this. But if we can discover that in different aspectival ways at different times, people could be better, then that offers hope for our own future, that we could do things differently. What if we borrowed the best ideas from different epochs and tried combining those instead of just relentlessly throwing out the baby with the bathwater the way we've been doing? So this is, I know I went on at some length, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, and my apologies for that, but I'm trying to sort of summarize 114 sessions in a nutshell. Sort of this is the purpose of the book. It's to immerse us in the ancient worldview, the medieval worldview, and then armed with those two worldviews to come back and look at the modern worldview and say, what does it look like, not from the inside, because we're the fish in the water that can't discover water because we swim in it all day long, but what does it look like from the outside? If I'm standing where the ancients stand, if I'm standing where the medieval stand, then what does it look like? So it's, it's interesting stuff. So this is, I guess, what I'm saying. I want to validate you on the one hand and say, yeah, these people did horrible things. I mean, what what Athens did in the Peloponnesian War was horrific. This is nothing to aspire to be like. But the candidness, that's something to aspire to be like. That's better than we are. And the idea, and we have the evidence. People in the past, at times, it was normal to look at the world in better ways in certain aspects than the way we look at it. So we could harvest that stuff. Maybe we could harvest that stuff. That's what the book's about. That's what we're talking about here. So I don't know if that answers your questions, Kaleem. It's probably just, a drop in the bucket. But keep coming back, and we'll keep engaged. Keep asking your questions. We'll keep engaging. We'll explore this stuff together, and it's interesting. It's interesting materials. I've been exploring Kenneth Smith stuff for, I don't know, 25 years now, and Donald's been exploring it since the 70s. It's one of the things that we like best about Kenneth is that rather than trying to convince us of a system the way a lot of philosophers do, he's constantly pointing to other historians, other philosophers, other writers. And so it's a great jumping off point for kind of a wide ranging study in philosophy, which brings us to Sharon. Come off mute, Sharon. Tell us what's on your mind.
So can we go back to the text? Because I would like to follow up on the sentence following the one that Stephen talked about. He says, the God Christianity conceive is a sole and solitary authority, a sovereign who acts on unilateral initiative, who is bound by no higher or lower order, owes nothing and needs nothing. And I want to frame this with the adoption of Christianity as part of the medieval era. And I think it was done by Constantine, and my memory seemed to tell me about the Council of Nicaea and all of that. And this was at the time, I think the Roman Empire, in the 500 years that it came apart, was just starting to come apart. And I like that sentence because Constantine needed to establish control, and the adoption of Christianity allowed him to do that. Can you comment on that? That's my impression of it.
Yes. Yeah, the Constantine's, cultivation of Christianity, and also his taking an interest in ensuring that the right sects of Christianity rose to power and the wrong sects were suppressed. Certainly many people have noted that it's very convenient for an emperor if he can get all his people onto the same religion, and if that religion really enforces the idea that there's a single source of authority, because that matches up with the emperor. He could say, and I'm God's representative, so listen to me. And that's the pattern that the popes would follow in the medieval epoch. It's like, I don't want 100 Pauls out there running around having direct communion with Christ through visions. That's really inconvenient because God knows what they're going to say tomorrow. I really want there to be a single voice that speaks in the world, and that'll be the emperor. And so he promotes that particular sect of Christianity in order to reinforce that. But what's really interesting about the book Creating Christ, which came out recently based on new archaeological evidence, is the idea that Constantine wasn't the first time Roman emperors got interested in Christianity, but the Flavian emperors, the ones who followed the Julian line, this is in the 1st century CE, the ones who conquered Jerusalem and Judea and Palestine, the ones who trashed the great the Jewish temple, those guys, that they apparently attempted to do a merger of Greco-Roman culture and Jewish culture, similar to how earlier peoples in Rome had done a merger of Roman and Greek to create the Greco-Roman culture. They tried to blend in the Jewish faith with the Greco-Roman faith, and that they did a massive religious PR campaign. And part of the reason for it was that they were frustrated with the way that the Jews were all revolutionaries. It's like they wouldn't stay put down every time they'd conquer them. Yeah, okay, they'd win, but then people would scatter to the desert and then start having little. Today we would call them terrorists, but I mean, and you could also say freedom fighter activities, refusing to bow down to Roman authority. And so this book, Creating Christ, argues that the Flavian emperors conceived of this idea to try to co-opt the Jewish religion and see if they could edit it in such a way that it seemed to reinforce imperial authority. And they looked around at all the different kind of Jewish revolutionary sects, and they found the one that to them looked like it was the most peace-loving, the one that said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, the one that had the guy who said, turn the other cheek. And they said, okay, that guy, let's promote that guy's stuff. He's dead, but there's prophets like Paul running around saying stuff. Let's promote them, and let's get some scholars in here, and let's write down some books, and let's see the things that they're saying. Let's transcribe it, and then let's promulgate that all over the empire, and see if we can split the Jews into so that they're not all revolutionaries. Maybe we can split off the peace-loving Jews, and give them imperial support, and blessing. And maybe that will help to cool the temperature of the revolutionary Jews by pulling their support out from under them. This is all really interesting stuff in Creating Christ. And the evidence for it is really interesting. I mean, you see there are Roman coins. Roman coins were like bumper stickers. They were the imperial bumper stickers of the era. They put little slogans on them. And it's only a few words, but they would circulate throughout the entire empire because money moves around. And so the emperors used to use them to spread memes, if you will, in the era before the internet. And so here are some memes that the Flavian emperors put on their coins. You're going to love this. Peace on earth, goodwill towards men. Does those sound familiar? We heard those anywhere? They were, for the first time, they cropped up on Roman coins during the Flavian Empire. At the time when the Flavian emperors were trying to cool things down in Judea, they tried to promote themselves as the lovers of peace and goodness, and that hey Jews, maybe you should listen to this Jesus guy, this Paul guy. They're talking about love and being kind to your neighbor. Maybe you should think about doing that. And then after the Flavian emperors, there was a big counter reaction among the emperors. The third guy, I think, maybe assassinated his brother and then said, nope, that's too far. It was bad enough when we imported all this Greek stuff into our pure, good Roman culture, but now you want us to have all this Jewish stuff in there too. That's it. I'm turning my back on that. We're not going to do that anymore. And he sort of, kind of closed that chapter of Roman history and went back to the good old Greco-Roman thing. And that's why, this doesn't show up in a lot of the history books, but the archaeologists found evidence. They found, long before the fish symbol of early Christians, the symbol that starts like in the 2nd century CE. That's the earliest time we see that. But around the time of the Flavian emperors, we find Christian tombs in the catacombs where the symbol that they have is an anchor with 2 dolphins around it. And that symbol is the imperial symbol of the Flavian emperors. And it's on the Christian tombs. And it's effectively saying, leave these guys alone. Don't desecrate these tombs. They're under imperial protection, which we didn't know. We hadn't done the archaeological research before that. So what we're seeing is this idea that the Roman Empire had been flirting with Christianity and adopting it a lot earlier than Constantine. And this is something we didn't know 5 years ago. We just didn't know it 5 years ago. We thought there was a long period of persecution of Christians, and then they finally relented under Constantine. But it looks like the Roman Empire, like you're saying, noticed the possible benefits of a peace-loving religion with a monotheistic God a lot earlier than we thought they did. I mean, this is what, the 6th, 7th, and 8th emperors?
Yes. Can you put the name of that book in the chat, please?
Yeah,
Creating Christ.
Yes, Creating Christ. It's new. It came out in just the last several years. And it includes photographs of, walls of catacombs, and here's the coins that they found, and blah, blah, blah. Now, the authors, their hypothesis is that they just invented Jesus and Paul, but I think that's going a bridge too far. I think the archaeological evidence doesn't prove that. It just proves that the empire was more interested in Christianity earlier than we thought they were.
Yes.
So, and there's cool stuff in there about Josephus and other things you might enjoy. So that sort of bears out what you're saying. It sort of bears out what you're saying. There's a natural logical affinity between the two. The downside, of course, is that as a monotheistic religion, Christianity has no tolerance for other people's religions. And so this is where I want to say to Stephen, does Christianity extend the lifespan of the Roman Empire? I think, like most things, it's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it does what Sharon's talking about and what you talked about, which is it helps to unite the empire, helps to get them under a single conceptual authority, and it helps them to be, you know, more focused on organization and so on. And those things are all good helps. But at the same time, it starts to let in the idea of genocide, because monotheism is very difficult to separate from genocide. Monotheism is the idea that everybody else is wrong. And if they're wrong, they need to convert. Or as Charlemagne put it, it's the cross or the sword, convert or die. That's a very natural consequence of monotheism. Polytheism, it's really hard to justify genocide based on religious grounds under polytheism, because polytheism is based on the premise that the sacred is complicated. None of us understands the full scope of the sacred. And when you meet some other culture and they've got other gods, it's not that they're wrong, it's that you're missing some things in your religion. You should find out what they've got that you don't have and add it to your religion. You know, this like it lends itself to imperial expansion, because people will fight for their gods fiercely. If you try to take their gods away, they will fight you. Well, as the Jews showed, they will fight you to the death. Right? Anybody has seen Masada, right? I mean, it's you get involved in wars at that level, and it's a losing bid. So when Constantine adopts Christianity, on the one hand, it's a great tool for empire, and on the other hand, it sets up the fiercest opposition to the Roman Empire that had ever been encountered before. And when the medieval epoch tries to take the idea of Rome and turn it into a world religion that spread imperially, the problem it has relentlessly from day one to the last day of the medieval epoch is that determination to exterminate all other religions creates the fiercest opposition from day one to the last day. They're just like, everybody they disagree with, you know, will fight them much harder than they would have fought the Romans. The pagan Romans would have allowed them to keep their religion. The Christian Romans won't. So it becomes a apocalyptic battle instead of a pragmatic battle. It's a mixed blessing, like a lot of things.
Yeah, thank you.
Great question, Sharon. Thank you. And you know what we see in this sentence, the God Christianity conceived of as a sole and solitary authority. Let's just, since we deconstructed that sentence that Stephen did, let's quickly deconstruct this before I call on Ari. Kenneth's doing the same thing in this sentence that he did in the other sentence. He's picking out critical points of the ancient worldview and showing how the medieval worldview is like putting a dagger into each one of them. So a sole and solitary authority, that's the antithesis of polytheism, right? So this is basically saying, we're killing your religion. Your religion is dead to us, and we're going to try to make it dead to you too. It's incompatible. There's no way for you to adopt our belief system and also somehow keep your existing belief system. They're as Hegel would say, it's a negation. We've found the essence of your belief system and we're negating it. We see this not just in this issue of how do you treat other religions, but also Zeus's relationship to the other gods is not like Yahweh's relationship to angels or saints. The other gods are his equals. He's first among equals. That's why Augustine uses that particular phrase to describe his role in the Roman Republic. I'm not better than you. I'm just the first among equals. He's mimicking what Jupiter says, what Zeus says. It's like Poseidon is as great a god as I am. Hades is as great a god as all of our souls are going to go to Hades when we die. That's an incredible amount of power. And I don't have that. I'm Zeus. I don't have that power. Hades has that power. Each of us has our, and this goes back to that question of moirai, fates and lots and aethai, walks of life. What is your way of life? And what are the things you're supposed to do? And what are the things you're not supposed to do? Even the gods have their time, their honors, their things that they're in charge of, and they can't trespass on each other's times. So Zeus doesn't get to be in charge of the ocean or souls or attraction or any of those other things. If he were above them, a sole and solitary authority, then he'd be in charge of everything, and they would just be his servants or lieutenants. But that's not the relationship that Zeus has to the others. He's only first among equals. And if he trespasses on their Time, he gets struck by the Furies just as badly as any mortal. There's plenty of myths about this, one god trespassing on another's terrain and getting zapped for it. So again, the opposite idea compared to the medieval idea. Who acts on unilateral initiative? Remember that the Greeks are obsessed with patho, persuasion. They believe, you know, I can't remember which guy it is who says, under the Titans, it was the rule of might makes right. The Titans fought with each other brutally, right? But a new era among the gods has come, the reign of Zeus, Zeus the Redeemer, Zeus the Persuader, who uses rhetoric and persuasion and wisdom to bring the others in line with himself. And likewise, he is willing to be persuaded. If he is wrong, and sometimes he is, anytime he's talking outside of his Time, he's likely to be wrong, then he's willing to be persuaded by the other gods. Can you imagine Yahweh first of all, being wrong, but second of all, letting Michael or Gabriel persuade him to do something completely the opposite of what he had planned? That's not how they relate to each other under the medieval framework. So this issue of unilateral initiative is another just complete rejection, not just of the old theology of the ancient world, but of its political system, which was, remember, among the Athenians based on persuasion, right? We have to develop rhetoric and persuade each other. Now it's based on force. One person has all the authority and everybody else has to shut up and do what they say, because he has all the wisdom, he has all the power, he has all the knowledge, he has all of everything. He doesn't need anybody else. And that's why he says, bound by no higher or lower order, owes nothing and needs nothing. It is a totalitarian relationship that's being described here, which had no room in the ancient world order. Even the emperors had to pretend, at least pretend, but frequently more than pretend, about their indebtedness. You know, one of the things that I'm going to grab another sentence here, and it's the sentence before the one that Stephen did, because it directly unites, Sharon, your sentence and Stephen's sentence. And that's this one. All that is in nature acts and is acted upon in a dialectic or reciprocation, a relativity of priority. That's the statement of the ancient worldview, right? That we're bound up in this matrix of meaning. We're caught up in these dialectics, in these palintropies. To be natural is to be marked by liabilities, necessities or needs, as well as powers and instincts for self-providence. And of course, self-providence, how much time do we spend talking about sophrosune, right? I mean, that's the issue, right? Sophrosune exists because we have needs. It's a value because we have needs. And so if we have a compass inside us that can point us the way towards the behavior that will most sustainably help us to address those needs, then we can be like the cheetah and survive. But if we lack that, then our lives are in danger. And so sophrosune is seen as a virtue not just for people, but for the gods as well. Because they don't, in the ancient world, they don't know everything. They can't do everything. They too have issues of sophrosune. But the ancients would say, unlike human beings who lack sophrosune and have to try to cultivate it through culture to develop their aratai and an atheia that will give them a viable way of life, the gods actually have sophrosune, like the animals do. They know which way is the right way to go to meet their needs. They know what to do. They know what their healthy choices are, and they can distinguish them from their unhealthy choices. But this new God is different. Right? The old gods were, when they wanted to impose form on the world, like when Prometheus and Epimetheus in the myth created human beings in the Greek myth, the substance he used to create them from, the matter, imposed its own restrictions upon the creator. He couldn't create in opposition to the clay that he molded people out of. Right? The clay determined what he could and couldn't do. Just like it would determine what a stonemason, the stone determines what a stonemason can do. The wood determines what the carpenter can do. This issue, I'm going to type it in the chat. Hule, the matter that the creator works with, and the way that the creator is restricted by the inner character or nature or lawfulness of that matter. This is an imposition that means that we don't have absolute power. A carpenter who disregards the way wood behaves is a bad carpenter because we're finite beings. We have to accommodate our plans to the hule, the matter of the wood itself, and recognize that the behavior of pine is going to be very different from the behavior of cherry, which is going to be different from, I don't know, mesquite. They're all different. And I have to respect those differences as a creator. If I don't respect those differences, I'm going to fuck everything up. This is how the Greeks saw the gods, that they were working limited by the matter, the hule of the material world that they were interacting with. But the medieval God, in part of the sort of theological arms race, he basically flat out says in Genesis and elsewhere, he had no restrictions at all. And John, I think, talks about this as well. He precedes the world. There were no restrictions upon him. Hule was not binding upon him. It did because they want to conceive of a God who has no limits, and that includes not being limited by the material you make things from. And so they believed, and they argued quite vociferously, that there was nothing before God. God made everything, and in the making of everything, it meant that his design was perfect, unencumbered by the restrictions of the material he was working with. This is the issue. There's a Wikipedia article about this if you want to look at it. It gives a little bit of information. It's this issue of creation ex nihilo. Right? The God of Genesis and John creates the cosmos out of nothing. And because he makes it out of nothing, he doesn't have matter handcuffing him based on the limitations of that matter and what it can or can't be made to do, the way a human carpenter or stonemason would have. And this is a central issue because it's part of the way that the early Christians are winning their debates against the polytheist ancient Greeks. Is they're saying, well, your gods are limited by the material that they work with, but our God isn't, because he made everything out of nothing. It's not creation out of existing material, it's creation ex nihilo. So this is what he's talking about here. And that's the significance of the part that, the sentence that you picked out and the sentence that Stephen picked out is talking about when we say he's a sole and solitary authority, we mean not just in general or not just in an imperial sense, but even in the sense of his acts of creation represent pure, perfect will. There's no wood grain or limits to the stone or to the clay impeding his creativity. He's a perfect creator who can his vision can come into being in a way that no human vision or ancient divine vision could possibly come into being, because they were all restricted by nature and he's supernatural. Does that make sense? So this is all the stuff he's really trying to get at here is again, by the letters, he's just knocking down everything we learned in chapter 4 and showing the medievals went right at each of those core issues and said, nature is not a source of meaning. It's not an ultimate authority. It's not a source of truth. It doesn't have any binding restrictions upon their creator gods. Their creator God is a sole authority. He doesn't have to negotiate with others. He's not part of the cosmos. He created the cosmos. He's not, all of the things. There's just like no down the list. Every one of them is rejected. It's a fascinating opening paragraph when you put it side by side with the section headings from chapter 4.
So that's why the wineskins are leaking.
That's why the wineskins are leaking. It blew the wineskins apart, right?
That's right.
Totally different. Totally different. So, hang on a second. This kitten is very pointy. I'm dying here. Thanks, Sharon. All right, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. This is quite an exciting conversation. It is so good to be here, and I want to say thank you. And next, I want to talk in a way I have never, make sure everybody can hear me. I don't think I'm going to speak in a way that I've spoken before. I'm going to speak a little bit more from what I actually think and perceive, as opposed to a more generalized, theoretical sense. And it has to do with my own personal experience as a Jew and I study a lot of different things, but of course, those are going to be my biases, so they're going to be tremendously blind spotted. I'm going to speak mostly in reference to maybe you have heard of him or not, but he's a relatively famous scholar. He doesn't live anymore. His name is Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, and he was the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth of Britain for many years, and he died in blessed memory 5 years ago or so. But I believe he's the only rabbi that I've ever studied who is both deeply knowledgeable in ancient traditional Jewish sources and what we'd call almost all the other sources he could get his hands on, to the sense that he's the only Cambridge educated rabbi I've ever known. And I'm going to pose something that we may actually just be obvious to everyone, we're not saying, or it might be something hidden that we're not saying, or it might be something we actually disagree with. And it's this idea that the more modern version of monotheism, that is the Judeo-Christian values, is we call monotheism, is that there's this single God who is completely omnipotent and altruistic, all-knowing and all-powerful, is not actually the original God of the Jewish people. And this sort of changed once the Jewish people lost their first temple and were exiled to Babylon. They experienced a religion you may or may not know of called the Zoroastrian religion. And this is probably famous to most people through Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And this is the introduction of a false dichotomy of the universe of good and evil. This was the unique aspect of the Zarathustrian God or ways, the religion, was there's a good way and an evil way, and that humans should do good or should do evil. Now, the traditional Jewish sense is, to some degree, there is a God who created, let's say, this universe, our world, and he may or may not be all-powerful, but it is hubris, to use the Greek word, to say we know that or not. That one of the prime tenets of Judaism is that we don't have access to God. We don't have access to reality. We only have access to descriptions of reality, and would be like our oral tradition or our Torah, our Bible, and basically what's been passed through the generations. But even if that were perfect, we would still say that that's not reality. That is just humans' experience of it, and that humans' experience of good and evil is more like good and bad. We can see the relative effects of good, the relative effects of bad, but as Hannah Arendt would say, he would say specifically, the only thing that truly makes us good from evil, and this, you do something that's relatively good for you, but evil for someone else, the only way to really transform that with human free will is something called forgiveness, where you can, and that frees you from the perpetual cycle of violence of he did something bad to me, so I do something bad to him. And we might say that that theoretically is evil. But from the Jewish point of view, originally, good and evil is in the hands of God and not in the hands of man. And also, the strangeness is that God is not this all-knowing, all-doing being when it comes to people. That is the relationship to God. So I would say the relationship, if we're going to do this hierarchy, is God is above nature, but humans are not above nature, and humans are definitely not above God, and we're not even below God. There's a weirdness of reciprocity, much like this statement in the ancient it's a dialect or of reciprocity, and it's more like a triangle of relativity. That it's important to note that the Jewish understanding of the making of Genesis is there's first 5 days where God did everything and it was good. This would be the idea that he spoke and he said it was good, and therefore it's not evil. When it comes to man, on the sixth day, he doesn't do this. He actually says a weird language that says, let us make man. And there's a huge argument what this means. Is he partnering with angels? Is he partnering with some other god? In a lot of the common traditions is that he's actually partnering with man himself, and that man and God are in partnership with making man. And it's sort of an experiment. And in the Jewish mystical sense, which is, again, mystical here means very similarly, stuff we don't have access to. It's not this like esoteric stuff that we can then label and describe. No, mystical literally means beyond human access for us. And in this mystical sense, that we say that we created ourselves in partnership with God, and we're in a relationship with God, and we're also in a relationship with nature. So we're both above nature and below nature, and in a strange way, we're above God and below God in this sort of weird reciprocity. And it goes as follows, that it's a paradox. All of these things are paradoxes, and that there are three fundamental paradoxes in Judaism. But we can get to this in a moment. But I think the point about that we created God, and the way to explain, if you want to use the Christian perspective, or even to some degree a very common Jewish perspective, that God is all powerful. Even if we don't have access to him, we could make some idiotic statement that he's all powerful, even though we don't have access to what he is. If we were to pretend he is all powerful, it's this idea that he, in order to make us and give us free will, made a recoiling of himself. The words in Hebrew in the Zohar are called tzimtzum, a reduction of self, so that there's room for something else that's not him. In the words of the clay and the formation of, like, this God is superior to your gods. Well, yeah, because this God does everything. But when the paradoxical sense, this God is inferior to your gods because he doesn't have power in certain areas. And the specifics is, it's like God made a boulder he couldn't lift. He purposely made a clay that was going to have an aspect of God or an aspect of himself that he couldn't control, that he's perfectly made different from the rest of creation. And it would be argued that maybe any sentient, conscious, self-aware being has this sort of nature. I look at this stuff in a practical sense. For our group, it would be nice to look at this from a mythological point of view. That this is a very practical way of using the world, as opposed to having access to what reality is. It's very helpful. And the three paradoxes that seem to keep Judaism going, because it describes the universe, or our experience of the universe, so well, and that's also how I believe mythology survives, is whether it matches up to our experience of reality, and whether it stays useful in keeping us surviving. These three paradoxes seem to be well agreed upon in most cultures in some form. And the first is that humans, or life, is both infinitely large and infinitely small. That to kill one person is to perhaps like to kill the whole world. Each person is priceless, and you cannot measure the value of the life that you're destroying. And at the same time, we're from dust to dust. We're just dust, and we'll go back to dust. So in one way, we have no effect on the universe at all. We're terribly small. And at the same time, because we have free will and consciousness and experiences, we're infinitely valuable. And this is a paradox that truth is somewhere in between there, or both. Some sort of mystery that's we could talk forever about. The second one is about a relationship with time. And the time is, in this case, is that we have free will when it comes to certain aspects of our lives. Whether I'm going to eat a banana or eat an apple, I can make that choice, or at least I believe I'm making that choice. I can go left, or I can go right, or I can choose to hurt this person, or I can choose not to hurt this person. I can choose to build with this hammer or go murder with this hammer. These are theoretically the choices for humans, what we call morality and ethics. And then in terms of actually what happens in the universe, and let's say the fate of the epoch, is also a reality. We are not able to determine what the consequences of our actions are. We don't have access to this. So yet we can choose, yet we don't have choice in the outcome. And so Judaism believes that the second paradox is that there is both fate and free will. And the truth is, again, found somewhere in between. And the last one is, this seems to be a relationship between actually how the brain really works and the nervous system really works, is whether things are experienced as good or bad. We have a positive valence for things or a negative valence for things in the neuroscience world. And this idea is that in the Jewish way, we look at this as towards a parent or a father. And God is like a parent that created us. It's this, you can both love your parent and want to come close. That's what becoming close means. In this case, this would be good, or positively. When people have a body language of goodness, they're open and they're coming towards something. And when they're scared or they're angry, they're pulling away. And that would be afraid. And so it seems like a paradox. How can you be both in love with something and afraid of something? And that is also that is the third and final paradox, that we relate to ourselves, each other, and ultimately God. And to get back to those three, how they relate to our relationship with the hierarchy of reality, is God is at the top. But God is also at the bottom of this. It's kind of a weird thing that God is both above nature, but also has created rules that he won't change and is below nature. So it's more like nature is a manifestation of God. There's this oftentimes in liturgy, things like God's arm or hand is doing stuff. That's more like nature, the rules of nature. There's a specific word for God, like Elohim. That means like the force of all forces. These are like primal natural forces that are untamed, that are just rules, almost like God is a programmer, that he made this program that's our universe. These are programs he doesn't change. He's not able to change the code, because then it would undo the universe itself and you'd have a new universe. And the next ones that we get to is that with man, that there is a strangeness in the code. It's not like there's just a code that's written. There's a self-writing code. And in this case, it more applies to life in general, I think. That life is this sort of evolving, adapting, self-referencing code that rewrites itself in genes or memetics. We've talked about this. This is the update of life or whatever. And in this case, God is not above these things or below these things. It's more like how close he is or how far away he is from these things. So the strangeness here is that, and still into this day, that of the Judaism that I mostly practice is this idea of paradox and not above or below, and how we form relationships with these things. And that however we describe these relationships are not reality. They're more like our description of reality that seems to work and seems to make it work. And I would say the thing that I want to bring forward with this idea that's really important for Christianity and a lot of other, perhaps Islam, this is where I'm not educated in Islam well enough, but definitely a lot of Judaism has this idea that there is evil and there is good, and that we should know these things. And we should know the difference between good and evil, because God is truth, and anything that's not God is falsehood, and God equals good and falsehood equals evil. And therefore being a Christian is good and being a heathen is evil. And this is where you get this sword by the sword, or we're with us or against us, this classic dichotomy. And this is where dualism is really the signature of what we would call monotheism. And dualism is, in fact, the bringer of polarization and the bringer of degradation in society. That the true nature, a source of violence, is oftentimes seeing something you have that you want that you don't have, or seeing someone that's us versus them and needing to destroy them. And the last thing to say about almost like the way that Greeks didn't know what to do with the Jews when they wanted to bring the Jews in and sort of make a cooperative religion. The Jews kept sort of what we call be contrarians. To some degree, this is our nature. Whatever the rest of the world does, we do the opposite kind of thing. That the Greeks very much wanted to do this. And this is our story of Hanukkah. They wanted us to be like them and to merge. And we said no. And they really got offended by this, that we couldn't mate with them, so to speak, that we wouldn't merge with them. And this idea that if we're not going to be with you, that means we must be above you. And to give one last nice thing about what Rabbi Lord Sachs talks about as what the nature of Jews and perhaps any ideal faith should be, is that you should, number one, be true to your faith. And number two, being a blessing to others regardless of their faith. And that idea is that God has expressions all over the place in lots of confusing real ways that we don't have access to. And that your way is maybe right for you, and it makes you a chosen person as a chosen people is. But this doesn't simultaneously mean that other people are not chosen any less than you are. Right. And this was, I think, the difference that snuck into with Zoroastrianism with good versus evil. That if you're not us, we are good. Therefore, you must be evil. As opposed to, no, we could be good and you could be good, or we could be evil and you could be evil. Right? That's a lot more confusing and definitely not modern in the way that we're superior to everyone else. We have truth and you do not. Right? That's a very dualistic smuggling of baggage that I think came from this Christian era. I know I'm doing a fill where I'm talking all over the stuff, all over the things. But I wanted to introduce the idea of dualism as a primary mechanism for exterminating that which is not, right? If you want to bring truth everywhere, that means you must destroy falsehood. And if we are truth, you must be false. And that is a very simple failure of logic there. There's a whole bunch of things you can, premises, axioms you can put in between there that gets you to different conclusions that if we're true, you must be false. How about a paradox? We're true because you're true, or we're false because you're true, or we're false because you're, we're true because you're, all these different things that have a much more complex relationship. And I believe personally in the complexity that we don't have access to these things in, not even in fullness, but only in a very, very tiny, small, the
Yes.
human brain has perhaps the way it gathers and perceives information is perhaps 1/1,000,000th of all the data that it could be accessing. This is
Yes.
how small our level of truth is, right? And to say that in a modern time where we have truth and therefore everything else is false is the representation, the manifestation of this dualism, this false
Yes.
dichotomy.
Yes.
And I think it's smuggled in with, if we're good, you must be evil. And this is where we lie. We have to do this cognitive dissonance of, well, we're going to come and take your oil and we're good. So now we have to spin a narrative for why we're good and therefore you're evil, right? We can't
Yes.
do the honest, open thing. We're like, no, we're bad and we just want your oil, right? We can't do that. We have
Right.
to proclaim moral superiority, or our whole sense of false dichotomy of good versus evil itself breaks down, let alone that we are the good and you are the evil, right? So
Yes.
there's layers, and I really want to see if it's possible to ask the final question about what does Kenneth Smith think. I don't know if he uses this word, this specific term of dualism. It doesn't really matter because you can coax a dichotomy with different phraseology. But ultimately, to me, it seems like the baggage that got smuggled into this era is good versus evil. And
Yes.
if we're with God, we're good. And if you're not with God, you're evil.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought this up, Ari, because I mean, part of it, what it shows is that, and there are other things that show this as well. Monotheism doesn't have to be equated with genocide. It doesn't have to be pointing in that direction. There are a lot of ways that monotheism can express itself. For example, you can have, what you've been describing, as I think of as the mystical tradition of monotheism, that says that the sacred is bigger and more complex than we can possibly imagine, and that we're at our best, we're struggling towards the truth. The truth isn't something we have in our pocket and can just summarize and make life and death decisions over. It's something that we struggle for lifelong, and anybody else who's struggling for it, is our ally, regardless of what they look like on the surface. And you see these traditions in Judaism a lot, with the I've always admired the way that the rabbinical tradition involves not just a memorization of an orthodoxy and then a recitation, but it involves a wrestling that you do with the material, because it's complex material and we're mortals in the face of these complex things. So that's one example of a way
If you
that,
don't mind, I want to say one more thing that's the Yuval Harari have brought in before that allowed the modern era to surpass the Christian era. And I'm curious if it's something the Christian era did to surpass the ancient era, which to some degree I'm saying about what you're saying, which is the mystical approach to life is the struggling, is the embrace of ignorance, right? Once you embrace ignorance, you can allow for accommodation and your fellow and all the strangers in between. But if you believe you know everything and that the earth is at the center of the universe and the sun is revolving around the earth, right? You got serious problems as soon as someone shows you something that's a contradiction to you, as opposed to, I believe contradiction is the signature of success.
Yes.
So you show me something contradicting, I'm going to say, yes, we're on the right track. In the other version where I know everything, contradiction is a threat to my power, and power makes the rules, as I think someone said, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
I wanted to ask this question of what aspects of the medieval era embrace ignorance, and where simultaneously does it reject any possibility of ignorance?
Yes. And these are things we're going to be talking about over the next year or two. I mean, this is deep stuff. This is big stuff. So I'm glad you got us kicked off talking about this, because I don't want to give the impression that the way that the medieval epoch expressed monotheism is the only possible expression. It's obviously not. You've got the mystical traditions side by side with the mystical traditions. Another one that you see in contemporary Christianity and Islam a lot is the ecumenical traditions. You probably see it in Judaism as well, where they say, because we all have only limited knowledge of these all-important topics, rather than trying to exterminate everyone who disagrees with us, we need to engage with the people who disagree with us in case they see part of this that we're missing. And in this, it sort of recaptures that original kind of polytheistic spirit that said, We just can't afford to be fundamentalist about things when we're finite, error-prone mortals. We have to be exploratory and collaborative in exploring these, deep subjects that matter to everybody. So I'm glad you raised this correction. And it certainly also means that, the medieval epoch could have developed entirely differently had it been based on Judaism or Islam in Europe, rather than if it were based on the particular form of imperial Christianity that came out of the gate holding, I don't know, half the deck, let's say. All the heresies it was trying to stamp out were holding the other half of the deck, but we'll get to that. That's another matter. So when we talk about this stuff in these opening paragraphs, Kenneth, he's not trying to summarize the nature of Judaism or the nature of monotheism overall or the nature of Islam or any other monotheistic religion. He's trying to characterize the specific sect of Christianity that rose to power and became the continuity, as Kaleem raised, of the Roman Empire, but in its new theocratic form rather than in a poly than in its previous form, I guess. And that's kind of where we're starting out this first chapter is more on those details. There's a lot more to get into. Of course, there's a lot more to get into in this stuff, but at this point, when we talk about spirit and we talk about the nature of these things, we're just talking about this. Where was the center of power and belief? Where was the majority? And we'll get into that. This is part of what we're expanding. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind. Oops, I accidentally muted you. Try again.
Yeah, I actually wanted to address what Colleen said. It seems to me other things have come up. So I'm going to try to relate that in a sense about what Ari said. In fact, I just to assure myself, I looked up the creation myth of the Old Testament just to do it. And I'll start there, which is very, very interesting. Because in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the water, I guess the water of the deep. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. So the interpretation of nothingness is very interesting. There was something before God, or at least simultaneous to God, that's the deep. In fact, I think another version says the face of the deep. So in some sense, it seems to be that there is a conceptual part of being and nothingness. Nothingness is deep. So nothingness is not just like it's a vacuum, it's deep. So it's facing that. And I could see, and when I'm thinking about this, first of all, how it relates quite easily in the transforming Plato into the forms are part of the surface of the deep. Okay, you can read it that way. And you could also read it like being a nothingness of sorts, which is interesting, being a nothingness, because we're all facing the surface of the deep. I didn't like Sartre's coining being a nothingness. I like to call it the being of nothingness, because in the deep, something comes out of the deep in some sense, and God pulled it out in some sense. And I think that relates to, I want to bring that to what Ari said. Well, first I'll say the problem is that people may have misinterpreted, especially maybe Augustine, interpreted Plato as this, in a sense, the mind of God, but in fact, it's the mind of man dealing with the deep, in some sense. So, and I should see that other people then have transformed that into like, oh, that's the ideological relationship and relationship to what existence is, because it's confronting the deep. But if you freeze that into the fact that oh no, we got the deep, it's called mathematics or something of that sort. It's like, oh, we got the tool to the deep at least. Then in a sense, you could see how that in a sense almost negates the deep in a sense, right? Because it's much more of a spiritual thing in a funny way. And this, I want to address Ari's comment, and I thought it was very important and interesting, is that, he was kind of criticizing Hegel, as far as I'm concerned, that in some sense, we have interpreted history as somehow providing a prescription to the future, in a sense of rolling. And what Hegel and what history has shown us is actually, at the best, a postscript of describing what has happened. And how do you transform a postscript into a prescription? Prescript. I suppose you could say, let's see. I suppose, for instance, the movies, there are sequels, okay, which anticipated that and how led up to that. Now there are actually movies like Star Wars, which there are prequels. In some sense, the postscript has become the foreshadowing of what had happened. So that's kind of interesting. We twist the time from the past to the future, and that's what rolls it to. And I thought I would talk about, let's say, one phrase by Nietzsche, the eternal return. Okay. Now the eternal return seems to be cyclical, right? You can look at it as like, oh my God, this is like Groundhog's Day. It's happening all over again, all over again. But on the other hand, how do you change the eternal return into something that is, in some sense, is married to a linear progression as well, a linear movement. Let's not confuse it with progression, because that sounds very futuristic. A linear movement. Well, if you're on a whirlpool, it doesn't just go around and around and around and around. That's in a merry-go-round, but it funnels downward. Now, if you turn that idea of the linear circle funneling, then what you have is actually the conception of ideas that's more like a screw. It goes around and around, but when it goes around and around, it screws into the wood or screws into the future. So in some sense, maybe there is a fusion between the linear progression of time and the circular progression of time. Maybe that's what the bud, the blossom, and the
Phil,
fruit.
I want to jump in and say I'm a big fan of Hegel, and I'm not criticizing him at all. In fact, I use a lot of his ideas as how I see my ideas.
Okay. Well, so it's, in some sense, maybe we ought to see that this round and around and around is not Groundhog Day repeating itself. For instance, if you take the circle and you turn it on the wheel, it actually gets you from San Francisco to New York. I mean, you're not just going around and around. I guess you could go around and around the block. You say, well, damn, this is like Groundhog Day all over again. So I think how you conceptualize these things is part of the surface of the deep, in a very shallow way. You could be much deeper than that. But so in some sense, even God has to deal with the surface of the deep. It's like there's something way beyond what presumed to be nothingness, which is the surface of the deep itself. Okay. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, these things are tricky, and we're going to have a lot of time to explore these things together. We don't have to try to get to the bottom of everything today, especially considering we're just introducing the first paragraph. But it is the nature of working with Kenneth Smith's text that he goes right for the jugular. I mean, he goes right into the juiciest, most fraught, emotionally and theologically and philosophically fraught issues from the beginning, in order to try to, establish what it is that we're grappling with. And his goal, which I would reiterate, is not so that somebody wins. Nobody gets to be right. He doesn't get to be right. We don't get to criticize him and thereby prove that we're right. Nobody has the core to the concept of this book. There is no single mortal position that is the right one that we should all have. And that's the winner. And everybody else loses. That's not how it works. The cosmos is infinite by comparison with the capacity of the human mind to understand it. And that means that the mere act of a mortal looking at the cosmos imposes a Procrustean bet on everything. It's the man with the hammer problem. We're massively warping reality when we look at it. And so each of us, aspectively from our different angles, is going to catch some things that other people miss, and we're going to miss some things that other people catch. So the goal isn't to prove the other guy wrong and to prove us right. That's not the goal in this book anyway. The goal is to learn how to have more than one perspective, which I know it's a really mind-exploding idea. But it's like, it's not that the ancients were right and everybody else is wrong. It's not that the medievals were right and everybody else is wrong. It's not that we're right, moderns, and everybody else is wrong. None of them get to play that role. Nor would Kenneth argue, is it the case that any one of us on this call has the one true accurate perspective, and our job is to show other people that they're wrong and that they should convert to our position. The goal of all of this is to learn to see the pros and cons of all of these different perspectives, so that we can shift between them and, pick up the best tool for the job and not insist on using a hammer for every problem, I guess. So anyway, so thanks for bringing that up, Phil. That was important. And I'm gonna call on James, and I'm gonna take us back to the text and see how much more of the introductory paragraph we can get through today.
Yeah, thanks, Rick.
There's so much to talk about here. I'm really having to hold back. I mean, I have the same tendency. I want to jump in and talk about all these details of circumcision and, the Trinity and, is there such a thing as Judeo-Christian? I mean, there's all this stuff that we can, but
Well,
we'll
two
have
sentences are not so bad. Two sentences.
We have
The Trinity
so
is
much
a great
time.
one. The Trinity
Say that
is a
again?
great one. The
Say that again?
Trinity is a great one. The Trinity is a great one.
Right, there's all this material and it's all juicy, but we've got 2 years to talk about this. We're just getting started today. So James, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, thanks, Rick, and everybody. I just want to go back to the original question asked by Sharon about the title, old wine and yes, what's old new wine and old old wineskin, right? So the way I read it is that that Christianity in paragraph 4 says right there, if I'm correct or not, that Christianity did draw its materials from pre-existing sources such as Platonic and Parmenidean, no less than Gnostic and Essene. Right? I don't know what Essene means, but it seems like Plato was a very major figure, right? That there was a precursor to Christianity. And there's a phrase I heard that's Christianity. Christianity is just a Platonism for the masses. And if that's true, then it explains why Christianity has this kind of separation of a God, absolute God, from nature. Somehow nature had nothing to do with who we are and what we are. But God did, God is the only authority and only absolute determiner of who and what we are, and that later on, hundreds of years later, it was Spinoza who actually tried to correct that, right, and came up with the notion that God and nature are the same thing. It's the absolute substance is God, and also it's also nature. So based on what Ari I just heard him say, that Judaism, acknowledges that kind of paradox of God and nature, it's just wanted to ask, why did the Jewish community excommunicate Spinoza for that kind of insight?
Well, that's easy because he doesn't actually respect the paradox. He just outright dismantles and rejects. It's not this you're right and I'm right. It's no, you're wrong and you're wrong. It's Spinoza is if we want to put him on the couch like a Freudian patient, he's got a lot of trauma, and he says a lot of things that include truth about things, but he smuggles in a lot of baggage that are to some degree just rejecting. It's similar, but I'm not sure if you're familiar with Simone Weil. She talks about why Judaism was an awful religion is because it was a religion of conquering. And she's specifically in the way the Jews, before they were Jews, they came into the land of Canaan and then killed everyone and made them all either convert or die. And then they not only did that, they killed everybody, the men, the women, the children. I mean, this is some awful next level stuff, what we would call. And the only thing I could say to this is it reflects a paradoxical, non-perfect way that in order to take the land, they were supposed to do these things in that time. And to some degree, a lot of that contextually looks evil. And that's very difficult. It's not right and it's not wrong, mostly because we're not them and we're not God and we don't have access to what actually is. So we have to make judgments about these things, but we have to be very careful not to generalize these judgments or scale these judgments in a way where we can extrapolate it as a formula. And Spinoza really does this. He really just says because something looks wrong, the whole system looks wrong. It's very much, he takes this sort of paradoxical, cyclical whirlpool thing that Phil was describing and turns it into a house of cards. And he says, you pull out one of the legs, the whole thing comes down. And it's just not a hierarchical level of cards. It's a paradoxical bottom up, top down, left, right, weird spinning thing. It's not to reduce it to some linear, simple representation is sort of undermining the whole process. And the strange thing is Spinoza tries to avoid this himself. He gets caught up in his own limitations, like we all do. And to some degree, he just does what a lot of us do, which is he is, ironically, I would argue this is a different discussion, but he is very much an animal before an angel. He has an emotional sense of self where he rejects Judaism and he rejects a bunch of stuff and then he rationalizes it, as opposed to being open-minded and saying, oh, some of these things are good, some of these things are bad. Maybe there's a way to do with some of it. Maybe there's something to do with bad of it. You know, it's not this maybe yes, maybe no. He's just very outright negative. And because he's openly hostile in a general sense, it's more like a sheep. It's more like the wolf wearing wearing the skin of a sheep, right? It's a wolf in sheep's clothing. And he may himself not have recognized this. He may have thought he was, again, almost like one of these, ironically, these inquisitors torturing people out of love. He's got an emotional and a sort of a dogmatic position, and then he tries to rationalize it. And at least that's my understanding of him. So he's a very complicated and fractured and sort of broken but beautiful scholar. But like any human, he is self-contradicting. I mean, he actually reminds me a lot of Nietzsche. He says a lot of stuff that he himself.
I understand he did have a lot of influence on Nietzsche, and very Nietzsche kind of sounds very much like him, but he also criticized Spinoza as well for not being up to a certain standard. But if you think of history as an organic process, then people studying Spinoza would understand him as a kind of a part of that organic process of development and evolvement from one phase to another. And just like from Plato to the medievals to Spinoza and then Nietzsche and so forth, and where we are. And it sounds very organic and part of the organic process.
Very much, yeah.
Thanks for your question, James, and thanks for the answer, Ari. Appreciate them both.
I also want to say my answer is limited, and I don't really have the answers. I'm just giving my opinion, and that Spinoza is confusing, and not so. You could interpret him in lots of different ways. So
Yeah. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I'll give you one of my little stories, but you'll like this. This is delicious. It's annoying because it's one of my little stories, but it's just too delicious for you to pass up. Now, I claim that I was a barbarian being trained as a Roman soldier in the imperial palace in the 420s in Constantinople. I even visited the Forum of Constantinople. I saw a few juicy things. Other people would just kill to have. But it wasn't illegal to be pagan at that period. There was still plenty of leftover pagans. The people the church was really worried about were the heretics. You know, if you're a pagan, you're just an idiot, you haven't learned, you got something wrong in the head, we'll just ignore them. You haven't seen the light yet. One day you'll see the light. But of course, heresy is the twisted. But this is the funny thing. They had the statues of the pagan gods in a special house where the pagans could go and visit them. I don't know why they had security there. They had what the Romans had as bars back in those days, which was actually a crosswork, not like our prison bars we think of today. The pagan gods were all in jail, but the pagan populace could still go and visit their pagan gods in jail. That's just so humanitarian. I know you're going to love what I just said. It's too juicy to pass up. Thank you.
It is juicy, Stephen. Thank you. Yeah, no, it's interesting the amount of energy that went into hating other Christians who weren't exactly precisely the same as the orthodoxy that was being promoted. And this isn't just an abstract dismissal, arm wavy dismissal. There's an enormous body of early Christian literature written by people like Origen that are, page after page, chapter after chapter about why the other guy's wrong. And they go into excruciating detail about what the other guy thinks and why that's why they think that's a heresy and why it has to be stamped out. And they would call together councils, and the councils wouldn't be, let's go exterminate all the heathens. We'll get to that later. The council would be, how come your belief in the relationship between the divine and the mortal within Jesus is a hair's breadth off from the way I see it? That's not okay. You have to be stopped. All this energy would go into these really fine points of theology. And I've spent a lot of time reading those debates. I mean, it's really interesting how much energy went into it. There's a scene in the movie Monty Python and the Life of Brian where Brian falls in with a bunch of Jewish revolutionaries who want to overthrow the Roman Empire. And they're sitting around an arena in the stands talking with each other and griping about the Roman Empire. But they also are griping about each other. And what have the Romans ever done for us?
What have the Romans done for us lately, except for build the aqueduct and give us the healthcare and the roads and the economy?
That's when the guy at the end says, "And peace." The guy goes, "Oh, peace."
Well, he actually says the only people we hate more than the Romans is the other Jewish front.
Is the other Jewish sects, right? So they have this whole discussion about how their liberation movement can't get off the ground because it's too busy fighting with itself, and they've splintered into all these different groups. There's the People's Front of Judea, and there's the Popular Front of Judea, and there's the People's Popular Front of Judea, and it goes on and on. I can't remember, like a dozen different names, just randomly reorganizing the words. And then there's one of them where they're like, one of the guys goes, "Whatever happened to the People's Popular Front?" And they go, "Oh, he's over there." And they all look, and there's one long-haired old man sitting by himself. And they all look away, and then they all go, "Splitter." And that thing about we reserve the greatest level of hate for each other We're so focused on ideological purity. Of course, they're not really critiquing the Judean liberation movements of Rome in that time. They're critiquing the left wing in the 1970s and 1980s, which is fracturing all over the world into 1,000 different splinter groups who all argue with each other more than they talk to anybody else. And yet, despite the fact that that was the Python's goal, was to critique modern politics, it's actually a really, yeah, thank you, Kaleem. I'm right with you. It was the reality in that time also. It was a really, really accurate depiction of the level of fury and venom that the early, and I don't mean early Christian church, but I mean, start talking 100s, 200s, 300s, the amount of infighting was astonishing. It's well worth reading up. It's well worth reading the details. What was exercising them so much? Like, especially the moment in history when they decided they all hated that Paul admired women as prophets. They all hated it. And they wanted him to stop saying that because they were having a backlash. They're trying to suppress women in the church and make them shut up and stay home and have babies. And they wanted the men to run everything. And so they had to figure out, how do we take the power away from all these women prophets who were so important in the first century? And among other things, they edited Paul's letters and they had Paul say things that Paul never said, and inserting these lines about women should be seen and not heard. They should shut up in church and not talk so much and blah, blah, blah. And the way we know they're insertions is, first of all, the insertions are very clumsily done. He'll be in the middle of listing, here's 6 important women prophets, and he'll list 3 of them. And then he'll say, and women should shut up and not talk in church. And then there will be the last 3. And you're like, is that how people talk? If I'm giving you a list of 6 people, don't I list the 6 people? And if I'm telling you these 6 people are great because they're women and they're prophets and you should listen to them, what are the odds in the middle of telling you how you should admire them? I then say, and they say, shut up, they're terrible people, but they're wonderful people. It's like you can see the seams. There's all this analysis that's going on now where they're picking apart this stuff. And one of the ways that they do it is that the editors at the time didn't understand the difference between jargon in different centuries. And so they're basically doing the equivalent of putting into Jesus' mouth, blessed are the meek, for they are groovy with their funky tones. And you're like, groovy, funky, wait a minute. Those weren't words that Jesus would have used. That's the 1960s and 70s. I don't think Jesus really said this part. And the people who are really good at studying Greek and Latin and Hebrew, they say these insertions into Paul's epistles are just every bit that obvious. They're like, they're using terminology that's centuries out of date. It's stuffing it in where it doesn't belong. And that's how they know that Paul was not a misogynist. Paul admired women, but people came afterwards and were inserting all this misogynist bullshit when they were trying to take back the power of the church. This is the level of infighting that's going on in the 100s and 200s and 300s in the Christian church. The different groups are really angry with each other, and they're fighting for the soul of the religion. And what is it going to be? What's it going to become? And the winners were the ones who managed to convert the religion into a religion that could be useful for the Roman Empire. That's how they won over the Flavian emperors. That's how they won over Constantine. They had to suppress the revolutionary stuff. They had to suppress the things that the Romans couldn't tolerate and turn it into something that they could adopt. And we know that, right? We've had these tug of wars for the soul of the religion ever since, over 2,000 years of wrestling over this stuff. And we'll have time to talk about all these things over the next couple of years. There's so many interesting materials to investigate. But right now, Kenneth's just trying to introduce us to the core idea, not of Judaism and not of all these other sects and not of Islam, but of the dominant sect that became the imperial church that was in charge for 1,000 years in Europe. That's the one that defined kind of the core of the power of the medieval epoch. That's kind of where he's starting with this first paragraph. Just that, nothing else. And of course, one of the things that he's leaving out on purpose, but he's going to come to later, is when you have religious genocidal movements like the imperial church of the Middle Ages, it's like Princess Leia talking back to Grand Moff Tarkin in the original Star Wars. The tighter you squeeze, the more planets will slip through your fingers. It's the squeezing that creates the rebellion. If you let people be, they might tolerate being a member of the empire. But if you squeeze them hard, then you basically give them no choice but to try to fight against you. So this interesting thing that happens in the medieval epoch when it comes to religion is the way that, on the one hand, you have the dominant theology that has all the power and money. But on the other hand, you have this relentless filigree of spin-off spiritual sects, some of which the church is able to suppress through violence, and some of which it's not, and it has to be spinning up new monastic orders left and right. Right? The Benedictines, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Jesuits, all these different groups start out as heretics. Basically, they're in opposition to the central power. And the church can't figure out how to hold itself together and get rid of them, so it accommodates them and says, all right, we'll allow this, and we'll say that it's part of us, even though it really bugs us how much the Franciscans keep pointing out that, we collect all this gold, even though Jesus says we should give it away. But we can't seem to get rid of these guys, so I guess we'll let them be a monastic order. So he's going to get into that stuff in the chapters ahead. We'll get into the depth and complexity of this. It's not going to be an abstraction all the way through. This is just a way to get started. So Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind, and then I'll see if I can get us through this paragraph.
Yeah. I want to, I guess, address Ari's thing about, I guess, interpretations. I mean, first of all, language is by its nature ambiguous, but even deeper than that is that it can't possibly express in an absolute way the ambiguities and the diversities of the deep, going back to the deep again. And I want to go through the decisive moment that somebody taught me about this, about the important moment of the Ten Commandments. Moses went up to Mount Sinai and met God as the burning bush. We all know that. And God wrote down commandments. And he was there for a long time. So when he came back, he saw that the Jewish people have begun worshiping golden calves, false idols, so to speak. And he got so angry that he threw down the tablet. And the tablet actually fractured. And that's an important aspect. So the decisive moment was not when God gave the Ten Commandments to Moses, but when Moses threw down the tablets, because his I guess his psyche got the better of him, and he got angry. He threw down the tablets. This is what you think of the word of God. He threw down the tablet, but that was a decisive moment, and not because he threw down the tablet, but because the tablet fractured, which means now you have a fractured Ten Commandments. That's by its nature exposing the opening to the deep, so to speak. So in some sense, I kind of always wonder whether that was actually that God already knew that this was all a kind of predestined, whether he knew that Moses would blow up and throw down the tablets and leave it the truth of his commandments that in a sense allow for the surfacing to the deep in some sense. And so therefore it requires the surfacing the deep requires everybody to be able to interpret and think for themselves, rather than hear the word and that follow the word, because the word will lead you to the answer to what God wants. But the answer to what God wants is for you to continue to explore the meaning of the deep in some sense. And in some sense, which means that there are always ambiguities and questions that you have to always follow. And I think part of the problem is that we've been trained so much in a sense, wanting answers, because, answers are nice. You don't have to think about it anymore. Just like follow what the imperial king says or whatever, or God, and you just obey and that's it. But I think what God did, or what I would say Moses did, by throwing down the thing, he allowed for human beings to, in a sense, exist in relationship to ambiguity of the deep itself. Remember, the deep was there from the very beginning,
Yeah.
even before God, but certainly at the time of God. So I thought I would share that with you, that in the sense we all obey the Ten Commandments, but we should in some sense question it in terms of how it actually applies in our situation as it unfolds.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it. Hey, Zelig, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind. Good to hear from you, man.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, Phil reminds me of because I've been studying Hebrew, and I ran into Exodus 3:14, 15, where Moses asks God to tell him his name, so that when he goes back to the children of Israel, they would know who sent him. And in the Hebrew, it's Ehye, Asher, Ehye. And when we look at that translation of Ehye, it's what we in English would have the word be or am. And it reminded me being and time. And it reminded me that Heidegger really was onto something about the nature of reality, you know, and in that passage of the Hebrew word of Ehye, it definitely took me back to those times that I was reading Being and Time for like the third time, and just connecting it and saying Heidegger was spot on. He understood that reality is something that is caused, and that's what the Hebrew word could mean in context, is the one who causes to be, the one who brings being into little b, right, lowercase b, into existence. And in that sense, it hit me, and I'm like, I wonder if Heidegger understood this particular passage here, and he was trying to recreate a philosophical perspective, not a theological one, but a philosophical perspective coming from the Greek mindset of understanding ontos, understanding ontology, with his background as a Roman Catholic. And so, in that sense, it just brings me back. That's all I wanted to say. It reminded me.
Thank you for that, Zelig. Yeah, this is good material. There's a lot to talk about here. So let's go back to the first half of the first paragraph, which I shared at the beginning. We've already covered some of these sentences, thanks to Stephen and Sharon and my going back one. But I want to hit the second sentence. I guess the first two go together nicely in this sense. Medieval civilization is the regime of the principle of spirit. That was the one last week that Sharon forced us to go to the text and actually talk about the text for a moment. The regime of the principle of spirit, and this is his way of saying, you know, in the nature, God, man sources of meaning, they're saying they've overthrown nature and put God on top. God represents spirit in the medieval framework. And he clarifies, spirit is the metaphysically peculiar principle classically called actus purus, or activity untainted by any passivity or suffering. That sentence is really important, and we've alluded to it in discussion already, but I just want to make sure we hit it. It's worth Googling actus purus, you know, in your spare time and look at it, because this is the core of the matter. This is the core of the difference between the medieval concept of God and the ancient concept of, you know, the polytheistic deities of, say, Athens as a counterexample. That all of the Athenian divinities, since, you know, I mean, remember, they've got generations of divinities. They've got the Titans before that and other deities before that, but that all of them are none of them have actus purus. None of them have activity untainted by passivity or suffering, because they're working within nature. So to some extent, their power is a pathos, right? Poseidon's power of the ocean is a pathos. It's defined by the ocean. He is the ocean. He's not an infinite creator who could have done whatever he wanted and he felt like doing the ocean. he, according to the traditional god, and I think it's in Hesiod's Theogony, I can't remember, the three brothers, Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon, choose what their different parts of reality are going to be. And they're elemental gods, according to Cornford. And Poseidon chooses water, and Hades chooses air, because Psyche, soul, is the breath. And the darkness and coldness of Hades are associated with air in the way that the Greeks imagined it. The Greeks didn't think of air as warm and bright. They thought of it as cold and dark. And they thought that's what the Psyche is, that inhabits you, that allows you to be alive. And then Zeus chose fire. Fire, all light, all warmth, the lightning bolts, all of these, the Greeks considered to be expressions of fire. And when Heraclitus talks about all things being exchanged for fire and fire for all things, he's reiterating Zeus as the authority under the Olympian religion in doing this. But, you know, his way of doing it is philosophical, and it is dependent. Again, it's not a God who has power over fire. It's a God who is an expression of the logos of the cosmos, in which all things are exchanged for energy. There's energy at work that we can't see on the surfaces of things, and that's Zeus. That's the power he is. None of these could be called actus purus. Every one of these, the action, the willfulness, the power that they have is heavily enmeshed with pathos, which is what he means by suffering here, right? Passivity and suffering. He's talking about pathos. He's not talking about a Christian or modern notion of suffering. He's saying, to what extent are you unfree? To what extent are your choices constrained by your circumstances? If Joe were here, he'd be saying agency and contingency. To what extent is your agency unencumbered by contingency? And to what extent is your agency limited by, or even defined by, contingency? And the ancient gods all had massive amounts of pathos in the expression of their power and their energy. What it meant to be an ancient Greek god is a radically alien thing from what it means to be the medieval god. They're just not the same thing at all. And you see this whenever people are playing role-playing games or making movies or drawing comics or writing novels, and they're always imagining what the Greek religion would be like. They always make it like the Christian religion. Oh, my God is Aphrodite. I like Aphrodite, so that's my God, and I worship Aphrodite. This is what people. This is how they have their D&D character. My character is a cleric of Aphrodite, right? This is their imagining of what the religion could be like, because we can't imagine a religion in which you don't get to have a God that's your God. They're all the powers of nature. Whoever you ignore, that's where the tragedies in your life are going to come from. I mean, it doesn't matter how much Aphrodite loves you, assuming she even did. If you don't pay attention to Poseidon, you go out on a boat, you die. The whole point of having a god like Poseidon is to remind you to pay attention when you go out on a boat. And the idea of Poseidon's not my god is the idea that I don't have to pay attention when I go out on the water. Because what, Aphrodite will save me? This is not how the Greek religion worked. These are gods with a huge amount of pathos and limitation. But not the medieval god. The medieval god that is the foundation of medieval civilization. Their whole conception of politics and cosmology and theology and everything else, it's all based on actus purus. God couldn't be, the medieval God couldn't be all good unless he was also all powerful. And to be all powerful means that he's not restricted by the grain in the wood. He's not restricted by what clay will or won't do. He's not restricted by anything. His plan can be embodied perfectly, unlike the plans of any ancient deity. And that's why he is held up by Augustine and others as the antidote to the corruption of the ancient world. I mean, they lived through that corruption. They know how horrible it was. They sat down to dinner, says Augustine, right? The husbands and wives, when Augustine was a little boy, they'd sit down to dinner, and all the wives had black eyes and bruises on their face because the men beat on them all the time. It was such a misogynist world. He says it was like hell on earth for women under the ancient order. But that had to go. That had to be overthrown. The reason medieval civilization rises is because the absolute inability to tolerate all the things that were so rotten in the late stage ancient world. That had to be stopped. It had to be overthrown. It had to go. But how were we to do that when the Roman Empire has all the power? You know, this is where all the energy is. There is all this theology and philosophy and just a history of ideas enmeshed in it. They need a trump card that they can lay down at any time to end any argument. And the trump card that they come up with is, our God isn't like your gods. Our God is incorruptible. Our God can do anything. He knows everything. He is everywhere. He has the possibility of bringing purity to human affairs if we will let him. And so the promise of the medieval epoch is we're going to launch a new world order in which all of politics will be grounded in this pure goodness. And that's how we're going to get the corruption out of the system. And it has to be an answer that big because the corruption is so big. They don't see any other way out. That's the only answer they could come up with. That is to say, this is a justification of Hegel's argument that these stages of development are not random any more than the stages of development of an embryo in the womb is. This is what had to happen next. It was the only way out of the trap. And if that involves a lot of contradictions in our brains, you know, for the medieval people, if there's a lot of strange logic that comes out of that, well, then that's a small price to pay in order to overthrow the evil and corruption of the old Rome.
Well, please clarify the fact that you misused the trump card. Why do you have to use that synonym?
I've been playing cards since longer than this guy's been around, so you know, I don't have a good verbal substitute. I just go with it. So, you know, all right. So that sets us up with, that's the first half of this paragraph. What he's basically actus purus, the concept of a will that's not bounded by the limits and constraints of reality. This is the core of the whole thing. And what we're going to see in the modern world when we come to it is that that same thing is the core of the modern order. It's just we relocate it out of God and into the human mind. So the human mind is so wonderful and objective and rational that we can see things the way they really are. And that allows us to make plans that we can carry out no matter what the material is that we're faced with. We will figure out how to make it work because we're just that clever. And in doing so, this is underscoring what Nietzsche says. Moderns, even religious moderns, to an extent that they aren't willing to acknowledge to themselves, have already they've usurped God by claiming that the human mind has godlike powers of actus purus. The ancients all believed that, and the medievals believed that, human beings are heavily enmeshed in contingency and fortune, and that we don't get to have actus purus. Our actions are all contaminated and interfered with and constrained. We're basically in shackles all our lives in various ways, like, you know, being born with the alcoholic gene. I don't get to will that away. It's in my genetic makeup. It's how it is. You know, I don't get to enjoy a glass of wine with my wife. She can drink, I can't. You know, that's just the way it is. And the ancients were comfortable with that. And the medievals were comfortable with that because they moved all of the freedom of will out of themselves and out of nature and into God, the one God. He has all of that power. And that's why he's our hope for salvation in politics and as well as in the life to come. So this is the core of the framework. And that sets us up for the second half of the paragraph, which I don't think we're going to get. Well, we might get through this in 3 minutes. It's pretty much just straightforward explication of what he said in the first half. So all creatures he made have specific instincts and motives driving their actions, but God alone is free in the ultimate sense. This is just a restatement, right? And of course, the reference to animals and instincts, what is this taking us back to? These are all the things we talked about psyche and ethos and arete and ethea and culture. Why do animals have sophrosune? Why do they know what direction leads them to health and vitality? And of course, why don't we? These were the core concerns of the ancient world. And he's addressing it here. He's saying, you know, God God is free in the ultimate sense. He gave those limits to the other animals, but he doesn't have those limits himself in the medieval sense. His power is infinite, unbounded by any rival principle, right? There's no Poseidon versus Zeus versus Hades thing going on here. Unconfined by any inner nature of his own. Remember, nature here is equated with ethos to the ancients, and that to the ancients, your ethos, your character determines your behavior. So if you want to be free, you have to learn what your ethos is and cultivate it and change it, because it's always going to be in charge, but you can change who's in charge if you work with it according to the things that it's willing to change with. And so this is the way that the Greeks have explained all living things, including rocks and streams, that they have their ethos, their inner nature that determines what they can and can't do. But we're saying that God doesn't have an inner nature. The medievals are saying God doesn't have an inner nature, because if he had an inner nature, it would limit him. That's what it means. Remember, they're not talking to us, and they're not talking to each other. They're talking to the ancients when they're trying to convert them. And so they're saying God doesn't have an ethos. He doesn't have an ethos, except for Octus Purus. His absolute freedom is the only ethos he has. He can do whatever he wants. That's it. Period. End of story, according to the medievals. So nature of his own, in the sense of a nature coordinated with and subject to the order of nature outside, right? Because why does the cheetah have an ethos or a nature? Because the cheetah has to coordinate with the life on the Serengeti. The cheetah's nature has been coordinated through evolution to match its habitat and the nature of the gazelle and the nature of all its other prey animals and the nature of the jackals and hyenas it needs to avoid after it collects its prey. All of these things have shaped the nature of the cheetah. But God predates all that. He doesn't have those kinds of limits. He can't have a nature, not only because it would restrict his behavior, but because it would imply that it had developed in order to harmonize with this larger thing, which would give him an element of pathos that we all have, that we're limited by being coordinated with the larger picture. And he doesn't have to be coordinated with the larger picture. He is the larger picture, says the medieval framework. He says that this power is capable of any effect, that is, omnipotent. The self-sufficiency and self-rule that Greek aristocracy took as the highest state for exceptional humans to strive for. Autarkia, right? That's what we're talking about. Autonomia, autarkia. Exemplified not just by the Olympians, the Olympian gods, but also by every animal's instinctual self-conduct. And of course, here again, he's talking about sophrosune. The animals have sophrosune. That is the self-rule that allows them to thrive. He says, in the medieval epoch, this has become an exclusive prerogative of this God alone, who possesses it in the superlative degree. He has all of it. Nobody else has any of it. That's the new framework. And it couldn't be a more Achilles heel strike at the one core vulnerability of the ancient worldview. Aaron, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. You get to have our final comments for today before we wrap up.
Oh no, I'll have terrible final comments.
Yay!
No, well, I mean, it relates to the same clarification that I wanted before about whether this medieval Christian God, in the first paragraph, when it says suffering, it really kind of means any effort, and then we're talking about how the God cannot, I mean, can do things without effort, even as part of that natural, what's the term? Natural relationships.
Yes.
Yes. So the medievals really felt that the God could just come down and blink them to the other side of the moon and do anything without, not even without blinking, just put them there. Decide they were there now.
At any moment.
Yeah. And did they fantasize horrors about what that God could do to them? And was that part of the whole medieval aesthetic and ethos.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's really, this is a great question. This is, you promised me horrible, but you gave me greatness. This is a great question. You know, there's all these Christian mystics spinning off over the course of 1,000 years, like Hildegard von Bingen, and writing about their ideas about this theology and what does it mean. And that you've got thinkers like Aquinas and Augustine writing extensively about these things. There's this rich literature from this period that talks about the sort of things that they imagine. And yeah, I mean, it includes not just gorgeous, wonderful healing miracles, but also hideous, terrifying miracles. If you look at the painter Bosch's huge mural painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights, you see in it, just, I mean, strange, bizarre things are happening in every square inch of that gigantic painting. And, that's him fantasizing about the sorts of things that God can make happen. Literally anything at any moment might occur. So part of what you got is, I mean, one way to think about it is that the gods of the ancient world before this, they were nature gods. They were limited by what nature can and will do. And as Heraclitus says over and over, nature is not random. I mean, yes, in the myths, Zeus turns into a bull, Zeus turns into a swan, he does all those things. But the Greeks believed those were not miracles. They thought that's how nature worked, right? That those things could happen. Whereas the medievals, they believed in a God of miracles, a supernatural God who could literally make anything happen at any moment. And the only reason that we get to draw one more breath is because God hasn't changed his mind and blinked us out of existence. So there is a sort of dependency, a much more intense dependency that the medieval person in his mind has upon his God compared to the level of dependency that, say, an Athenian felt towards, I don't know, Demeter or Hephaestus. It's a radically different kind of relationship because anything might happen at any moment. You just don't know. And the result is, among other things, in politics, sometimes things really did just come out of nowhere. I mean, Joan of Arc came out of nowhere. Nobody could have foreseen an illiterate peasant girl raising the largest army that France had ever seen and kicking the ass of the English. I mean, this is just insane. This is nuts. But, when you believe that miracles could happen at any moment, people are prepared to just take a complete radical left turn in a way that they aren't under belief systems that are more incremental and sort of law or natural law driven. So it's a great question, Aaron. And we're going to see a lot of that as we go ahead. Phil has his hands up, but we're 6 minutes after. I wonder if Phil can remember for next time.
Oh, this is really just a quick question. I mean,
go ahead.
If God is an interventionist, I mean, have we adapted that in the modern society? Because like we think of ourselves as having a free market, but we know intervention is everywhere.
Yes.
Intervening in the freedom of the market. So
yes.
In that sense, we adapted that from the divine law of God in the human manifestation. I'll just leave that as a comment. You could answer or not.
I'll give you the shortest of answers. Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, was his most famous lecture that terrified the Puritans he was or the New England people that he was lecturing to. The core of his statement goes to the heart of the medieval theology, which is this idea: things don't happen because nature is lawful. Nature is not any source of meaning or authority. It doesn't have any laws. The only reason anything happens from one moment to the next is because God hasn't changed his mind yet. He's the only thing keeping you from dropping into perdition. And if he loses his concentration for even a moment, we're all doomed. Like every bud that opens, every breath that you take that still has air, every chair that continues to hold you up and not drop you to the center of the earth, every single thing that happens not because of lawfulness, but because God is great. And he decided all of those infinite number of things, instant by instant by instant. So what we're seeing is not any obligation on God or any restrictions or any which would be implied by a lawful nature. What we're seeing is just how incredibly sophisticated God's mind is and his incredible powers of concentration, that he doesn't miss a beat. But at any moment, this could all end. We could just drop into the center of the earth. You know, if he hiccuped or sneezed, which he would never do because he's perfect. This is the conception. And you see this when you see illustrations. There's arguments about where do flies come from? Where do maggots come from? Where do rats come from in the Middle Ages? And they're inventing this idea that you put out food and the animals spontaneously generate out of the food. The whole idea of reproduction and laws of development and all of those things, they're just like lost on huge numbers of people in the medieval epoch because they're ready to believe that every single thing that happens is a miracle. We went this way today, it could go completely differently tomorrow. You don't know. It's an alien worldview. So yeah, great questions. Anyway, thanks everybody. I hope you had a great time. I'm looking forward to doing this again next week. This is I'm going to echo what Ari has said last time, which is this is my favorite part of the week each week. And Aaron, yeah, then maybe 3 weeks from now we can catch you. But really enjoyed your participation today, and thanks as well to you, Colleen.
So we will be in paragraph
cool
2. We will be in paragraph.
We'll do paragraph 2. We'll do paragraph 2. It only took 3 hours, but it was good. Everybody brought their experiences. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks a
So
lot.
good to see you.
Thanks.
Take care.
See you next week.
Bye, guys.
Bye.